Driving at night has always been one of my favorite things to do. There's something incredibly freeing about being alone on the road. No traffic, no chaos, just me, my car, some low music, and the darkness surrounding everything. If the road is long and lined with dense forests, even better. There's just something special about those solitary drives, almost meditative, that has always drawn me in. That's why, about 6 years ago, I finally decided to drive the entire length of the Blue Ridge Parkway. I'd always dreamed of covering those 469 miles of scenic road through the Appalachian Mountains, connecting Shenandoah and Great Smoky Mountains National Parks. For years, I looked at pictures, read about the route, and promised myself that one day I'd do it. Finally, I got 8 days off in a row, and I didn't think twice. I grabbed my dog, Charlie, packed my bags, filled up the tank, and hit the road. The first few hours were incredible, exactly how I had imagined. The scenery was breathtaking. The road twisted through the mountains, and the silence was almost absolute, only broken by the sound of my tires on the pavement and the wind passing through my slightly open windows. Some parts of the route were trickier, with tight curves and stretches where the road wasn't in the best shape, but nothing that made me regret the trip. But after hours of straight driving, exhaustion started creeping in. I knew I needed to stop for a bit, drink some coffee from my thermos, stretch my legs, and let Charlie out of the car for a few minutes. That's when things started to feel off. As soon as I turned off the engine, Charlie, who had been lying calmly in the back seat, immediately lifted his head and locked his eyes on the trees around us. He didn't growl, didn't bark, just sat there, completely still, ears perked, staring into the dark forest. I had never seen him like that before. Charlie was always a laid-back dog, never bothered by anything. In that moment, I knew I had to trust him. Something was out there. Something he could sense before I even realized it. A wave of dread washed over me, and without thinking twice, I started the car again and got back on the road. But Charlie never relaxed after that. For miles, he just sat there, staring out the window, watching something. Something that felt like it was following us in the dark. I kept telling myself he had probably just gotten spooked by a deer or some other wild animal, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Eventually, I tried to push those thoughts aside. I'd been driving for too long, and even though Charlie's reaction had unsettled me, I really needed to stretch my legs. So I pulled over again. This time, I wasn't hesitating. I opened the door to let Charlie out, but the second I did, he bolted, straight into the forest. No warning, no hesitation. It was like something had called him. My heart dropped. Charlie never did that. He was a trained dog, always obedient. He would never run off into an unfamiliar place without my command. I shouted his name, but he didn't slow down. Without thinking, I ran after him. The forest was dark and dense, and within seconds, I'd lost sight of the road. The ground was covered in dry leaves that crunched beneath my feet, and low branches scraped my arms as I tried to keep up with Charlie's quick, frantic movements between the trees. I called for him again. Nothing. Just silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that made me stop in my tracks. I had no idea where I was anymore, and for the first time, I felt real fear. That's when I realized we weren't alone. Something was moving around me. Small noises, twigs snapping. The sound of footsteps on the dirt. I was surrounded. Panic took over, but before I could react, I heard Charlie yelp. Not a normal bark. A scream of pain. The kind that breaks your heart if you love animals. I took off running toward the sound, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. When I found him, he was on the ground, panting, eyes wide. I scooped him up into my arms. My instinct screamed at me that we couldn't stay there for another second. Something was there with us. And if it was a bear, we had no chance. I didn't wait to find out. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, not looking back. Charlie was heavy, but adrenaline gave me strength. I could feel it, whatever it was, chasing us. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I had to move. When I finally saw the road, and then the car, it felt like a miracle. The doors were still open from when I jumped out. I leaped inside, put Charlie on the seat next to me, and floored it. That's when I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. It wasn't a wild animal. 4 men standing at the edge of the road, just beyond the trees. They didn't move. They didn't run after the car. They just stood there, watching. I didn't stop until I had put miles between us. Only then did I finally pull over to shut the back door and check on Charlie. What I saw made my blood run cold. Right on his shoulder blade, just behind his neck, there was a hole in his skin. Something had ripped a chunk of flesh from that spot. That's why he had been crying out in the forest. I started the car again and sped to the next town, desperate to find a vet. When I got there, it was late and the clinic was closed, but there was an emergency number. Less than 30 minutes later, the vet arrived. When I explained what had happened, I watched the color drain from his face. He told me this was the 4th case he had heard of. The 4th case since the beginning of the year. Then he confirmed something that made my stomach turn. Charlie had been bitten by a human. The marks were human teeth. But how the hell did someone bite him hard enough to rip out a chunk of flesh? Especially from a 55-pound dog with thick fur? The weirdest part was how Charlie had sensed something was wrong miles before we even stopped the car. There was no way those men had traveled that far on foot through the forest. I filed a report with the police, but to this day I have no answers. For everyone who's worried about Charlie, he's okay. He has a scar there, and the fur never grew back, but he's fine. Whenever people ask what happened to him, they either get shocked or think I'm messing with them. But one thing's for sure. Something is seriously wrong in that part of the country. I don't know what it is, but I have a feeling it's still out there. Hey, horror spectator here. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on post notifications so you're always in the loop when new videos drop. We post 2 videos every week. If you're really into this content, consider sharing it with your friends. It really helps us grow this community. Now, let's move on to the second story. What I'm about to tell you happened in the summer of 2002. I live in Monson, a town in Hampton County, Massachusetts. For those who don't know, Monson is near one of the most isolated parts of the Appalachian Trail, known as the 100-Mile Wilderness. This trail stretches northeast from town and ends just outside Baxter State Park, a remote, densely forested area where civilization feels distant and irrelevant. I was never really into Appalachian stories. My family was never the outdoorsy type. We didn't hike, camp, or do anything remotely adventurous. For us, the ideal way to spend time was indoors, away from the unknown. Maybe that's why I was so fascinated by Sarah, a girl from my school who lived in a remote area, in a wooden cabin right next to the trail. She grew up surrounded by nature, knew the sounds of the forest the way I knew the sounds of the city, and talked about playing in the woods with such excitement that I always wondered what it would be like to live that way. For years, I wanted to see her house, but my parents were paranoid about anything involving being in the middle of nowhere. By 2002, I was in my senior year of high school, and my parents had lost some of the control they used to have over me. Plus, I had a babysitting job, which gave me the perfect excuse for the night of July 11th that year. Sarah invited us over for a sleepover, since her parents were going to be out for the weekend. I knew I wouldn't be able to stay the whole night, but I planned to stay as long as possible. I told my parents I was babysitting and headed to our meeting spot, a gas station where Olivia, the only one of us with a car, was going to pick me up. When I got there, I could tell something was off. Olivia was standing next to her car, visibly uncomfortable. Parked beside her was an old pickup truck, and two men were talking to her. As I got closer, I saw they looked dirty and scruffy, but they were acting like they were God's gift to women. They were asking her where she was going, and if she needed some company. Olivia was ignoring them, but you could tell she was freaked out. As soon as she saw me, she jumped into the car, and we drove off without saying a word. On the way, we talked about how gross and creepy those guys were. But by the time we got to Sarah's house, we had pretty much put it out of our minds. The cabin was amazing, sitting in a clearing surrounded by towering trees. It was a big house but had this rustic, cozy feel to it, with a wooden porch and dim lights that made it look warm and inviting. As soon as we got there, we joined the other girls and kicked off the night with games, movies, and non-stop chatter. At some point, Denise went to the bathroom, and when she came back, she was pale. She said she saw someone peeking through the window. Sarah laughed, convinced it was just a prank to scare us, but Denise's face said otherwise. Olivia and I exchanged a nervous look. I told the group about the men at the gas station, and Olivia immediately grabbed her phone and called the cops. She said we weren't going to be the dumb girls in horror movies who stick around to see what happens. That decision might have saved our lives. Not even 5 minutes later, the power went out. Then came a loud crash from one of the windows. We ran to shut all the blinds. We knew someone was trying to get in. Sarah, knowing the house better than anyone, told us to head to the basement where her dad, a wine collector, kept his collection. The wine room had been reinforced the previous year and had a lock. We ran for it without hesitation. We had barely shut the door when we heard glass shattering and a man's voice calling out to us. The mocking tone was unmistakable. It was the guy from the gas station. They had followed us. We crammed into the tiny room and locked the door. It was a solid door, which gave us some sense of security, but we were terrified. We could hear them moving through the house, knocking over furniture, breaking things. They laughed, shouted disgusting things, enjoying the fear they were causing. Then, their footsteps got closer to the basement stairs. We heard the creaking of the steps. One of them touched the door. That's when Denise let out a sob. The silence on the other side lasted only a second before we heard a low chuckle. They knew exactly where we were. Time stopped making sense. The men started pounding on the door, each hit shaking the tiny room. I could hear the girls' ragged breathing, muffled sobs, sweat dripping down my face. They were trying to break in, laughing, hurling insults. There was no way out. Then, we heard it. A siren in the distance, the most beautiful, terrifying sound we'd ever heard. One of the men swore loudly. Another shouted that he would find us one by one. We heard rushed footsteps, the sound of something crashing. Then silence. Footsteps retreating. When we finally unlocked the door, we were shaking so badly we could barely walk. The cops arrived at the cabin and found the place wrecked. Furniture overturned, lamps smashed, cabinets ransacked. Everything pointed to the fact that if we hadn't hidden, the night would have ended very differently. Sarah's parents came back that same day and stayed with relatives for a while. The house no longer felt safe. The police investigated, but they never found the men. The case was closed, one of those unsolved crimes that haunt small towns. My friends moved away, built their lives elsewhere. I was the only one who stayed. I never felt safe in my house again. I know the people in Monson. Those men weren't from here. But I never forget the words one of them shouted before leaving. "I'll find you one by one." Even now, when I'm alone at night, I hear that voice in my head. And I wonder if someday he'll keep his promise. I've lived my whole life in the outskirts of the Appalachian Mountains, specifically in Helen, Georgia. I grew up surrounded by these mountains, learning to respect their vastness and unpredictable nature. From a young age, I heard stories about people disappearing, hikers who never came back, hunters who wandered too deep into the forest and were never seen again, tourists who weren't prepared and just vanished. These were whispered stories, passed down by the older folks, discussed in obscure corners of the internet, but never really explored by the news or the authorities. I never fully understood why. In the past few years, I started noticing a pattern. The area where I lived was relatively safe, but if you went a little deeper into the lesser-known trails, the disappearances became absurdly frequent. I started gathering every bit of information I could. Hikers saying they felt watched, maps marking places where search efforts turned up nothing, scattered testimonies that never got validated. Everything pointed to one specific area, a dense, remote patch of forest where it seemed like the earth just swallowed people whole. But why wasn't the police making this connection? Why weren't the newspapers talking about it? That's why I convinced a few buddies, guys who knew the trails well and were experienced hikers, to come with me. We weren't amateurs. We knew how to navigate the woods, how to read nature's signs, how to stay safe. We packed backpacks with essentials, flashlights, knives, 2 guns, and even a satellite phone and radio to make sure we wouldn't lose communication if things went south. The plan was simple. Follow the clues. Look for any trace of an explanation for what was happening out there. The hike was long, but fun. There were 5 of us, and aside from me, none of them really believed anything was wrong. They thought I was being paranoid, that this was just another adventure. But as we went deeper, something in the atmosphere changed. The jokes faded. The laughter died down. That's when we found the cabin. Small, handmade. Like someone had built it from whatever materials they could find. Nothing about it seemed particularly strange. We had seen a few like this on other trails before. Figuring we were near someone's private property, we decided to move away from it. But, as we did, Mark called out to Dennis a little too loudly, and in response to the noise, someone inside the cabin started screaming for help. A muffled cry from within, then multiple desperate pleas. We froze, exchanged nervous glances. I swear, at that moment, all of our blood turned to ice. We didn't know if it was a trap or if someone was genuinely inside, but something inside us told us we had to act. We moved toward the door, trying to figure out what was happening, and that's when we saw them. 2 men stepped out from behind the cabin. Their clothes were worn, dirty. Their faces looked hardened by time and isolation. Something about their eyes was off, almost animalistic. But the worst part, the weapons they held like they were second nature. They didn't say a word, just stood there, watching us, like they were deciding what to do with us. Then, one of them raised his gun and fired a shot into the air. Not meant to kill, just a warning. A silent order for us to leave. We didn't think twice. We turned and ran. We weren't trying to abandon whoever was inside, not at all. But we needed to get away first, to call for help. Fear pushed our legs forward, but the forest was dense, the terrain unforgiving. I stopped for a second to catch my breath, and heard the footsteps behind us. Someone was chasing us. We didn't know if they were just trying to scare us, or if they had worse intentions. But we weren't about to stick around and find out. We ran until our lungs burned, until our legs felt like they were about to give out. At some point, the footsteps stopped. We don't know exactly when. At that moment, we reached for the satellite phone to call the cops. But that's when we realized Mark had left his backpack near the cabin. In the chaos, he hadn't grabbed it, and none of our normal phones had service. We had no choice but to walk to the nearest town and call the police from there. The walk was harder than we expected. We were exhausted from running, anxiety sky high, every little noise from the trees around us feeling like a potential threat. But after 2 hours, we made it back to town. We told the police everything about the cabin, the screams, the armed men. They listened, but I could tell right away they weren't taking us seriously. We're in our 20s, and to most people, we're just a bunch of dumb kids trying to stir up trouble. Still, they agreed to send a search team, but when they got there was nothing. The cabin was still there, but it was neat and orderly, like no one had been there in a long time. The cabin belonged to some guy who was currently out of state, only using it twice a year. No signs of the men. No signs of anyone having been there recently. We kept insisting. Told them everything in detail. Dennis, who has a great memory for faces, gave a detailed description of the two men. But there was no evidence to back up our story. The voice we heard sounded like a woman's, but we couldn't even be 100% sure of that. No one had been reported missing in that area recently, so as far as the police were concerned, there was nothing. They told us to drop it, move on. But we knew. We knew something was very wrong with that cabin. We knew someone was inside, begging for help. And we knew those men weren't messing around. It's been 14 days since then, and I can't shake this feeling. Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're exploring two stories of people who ventured into the Appalachian Mountains searching for peace and nature, but instead found something far more sinister. From a group of friends who decided to explore the tunnels hidden beneath the mountains, to a small community living deep in the woods that's slowly being hunted. These stories got under my skin, and I hope they do the same to you. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. This is a story I don't usually tell, and I definitely never told it like this before. I've shared it with a few people, sometimes because I knew they wouldn't believe me, other times because I knew they would. Either way, it's something we never really talk about openly, mostly because every time I think about it, my stomach tightens up and my hands start shaking a little. It's one of those memories that never really fades, even after decades. It happened in the summer of 1983, deep in the Appalachian Mountains of Western Virginia. Back then, I was 19, and my friends and I were always chasing something to do. None of us had money, and most of us still lived at home, so we made our own adventures. It was a time when that part of the country was mostly forgotten, especially the area we were from. Not that things are much different today, but with the internet, it's gotten a little better. I'm not going to say exactly where I'm from, though some people might figure it out. I just don't want this story coming back around dragging my name, or the names of the people who were with me. I mean, I want to tell it because I need to, but I don't want to be associated with it. And I don't want my old friends to be either. They've all left it behind, and I don't have the right to dig it up again, especially without their permission. I tried reaching out to them before sharing this, but they've all left the state, and I lost touch with the rest. I'm the only one still around here. So, all the names, just so it's clear, aren't real. I hope you can understand my side of it. So, there were 5 of us. Me, Michael, Greg, Tommy, and Aaron. We'd grown up together, spent our teenage years messing around in the woods, hiking, camping, fishing, all that. But that summer, I'd gotten obsessed with something else entirely. Caves. I'd found this old geology book at a thrift store that talked about the cave systems beneath the Appalachians. How they stretched for hundreds of miles through limestone and dolomite, twisting and folding with the mountain's age. It said that beneath those ridges ran a hidden world where the water had carved its way for millions of years. Massive chambers connected by narrow tunnels, so old they predated the mountains themselves. The thought of it got under my skin. The idea that there was an entire landscape right below our feet that hardly anyone had seen. I read everything I could find after that. Talked to local rangers, even bought a cheap map that marked known entrances. I was completely hooked. That's what led me to talk the guys into coming along. I told them it'd just be a few days camping near a small town not far from where we lived. A place known for its network of caves that supposedly went on for miles. It was something we'd done countless times before. They were all as thrilled about it as I was, so we packed light, sleeping bags, flashlights, some food, and a few old climbing ropes that belonged to Greg's older brother. None of us really knew what we were doing, but we didn't care. We were young, dumb, and too sure of ourselves to imagine anything could really go wrong. As you can imagine, I carry a huge weight knowing I was the one who suggested it. But I was young. And when you're young, you think bad things only happen to other people. The first two caves were pretty standard. Tight spaces, cool, damp air, slippery rock. We laughed most of the way through them, taking turns pretending to be explorers. The routes had been great for building our confidence. They had good light and decent visibility. It wasn't until the third cave that things started to feel wrong. It was late afternoon when we found it, tucked into a slope behind a wall of thick pines. On the maps I'd bought, that route was one of 5 marked with an X, and I wanted to find out why. The entrance was narrow, just a crack between boulders, and the air seeping from it was cold enough to raise goosebumps on my arms. Before we went in, I warned everyone that the cave might be unstable and that we'd need to be careful. I told them it was marked with an X, so there was probably something dangerous about it. But instead of seeing that as a red flag, we were stupid enough to see it as a sign of adventure. We tied a rope at the entrance just in case, and started making our way in. At first, it wasn't that bad. The tunnel opened into a wider passage that ran straight for what felt like 100 feet, before turning sharply left. That's where we saw the first symbols. They were carved into the walls, deep and uneven, as if someone had used a knife or a rock. Circles crossed by jagged lines, triangles filled with scratches, shapes I couldn't make sense of. Nobody said anything, but the mood changed instantly. It was like the air itself had thickened. I could hear everyone's breathing getting heavier, faster, even though no one was moving much. It was a mix of excitement at finding something ancient, but at the same time, the terror of it being something evil. We kept going, mostly because none of us wanted to be the first to say we should turn back. After another stretch, the tunnel widened into a small chamber. The floor was covered in something dark, wet-looking, like mud or rot. It stuck to our boots and gave off a smell that hit so hard it made my eyes water. Greg gagged, turned around, and threw up against the wall. The smell was unlike anything I'd ever known, sweet and rotten at the same time, like decay that had been sitting too long. On the far wall was a wooden cross, about 3 feet tall, nailed into the rock and turned upside down. There was something written on it, but the light from our flashlights was weak and shaky. I stepped closer to read it, but I never got the chance. From the opposite side of the chamber, deep in the shadows, came this sound. Sharp, high, and completely unnatural. Like metal scraping glass, followed by a rush of movement. I can't even describe the noise properly because we all heard something different. The only thing we agreed on was that it wasn't made by people or animals. Then, something lunged at Greg before any of us could react. He screamed, and all our lights swung toward the sound, catching a flash of something pale and hunched. Instinct took over. I grabbed the cross off the wall. It came loose with a crack, and swung it as hard as I could toward the shape that was dragging Greg down. It wasn't something I did consciously. It was pure instinct to grab that cross and use it as a weapon. The sound it made when I hit it was awful, like striking wet meat. Greg slipped free and scrambled backward, but before I could pull him up, more of those things came crawling out from the dark edges of the chamber. Dozens, maybe more. I don't even know. By that point, my vision was blurred from panic. I honestly felt like if I'd stayed there another second, I could have died from a heart attack. We ran in pure panic. The rope we'd tied earlier was the only reason we made it out at all. I followed that line like my life depended on it, because it did. My throat burned from screaming and breathing in that foul air, and I could barely hear anything over the pounding in my chest. I didn't know if the sounds behind me were my friends or those things chasing us. Finally, a faint light appeared ahead, a thin beam that cut through the darkness like a promise. I ran toward it, tripping over the uneven rock until the tunnel spat me out into the open. I fell hard onto the dirt, gasping, lungs burning like I'd swallowed fire. Michael was already outside, crouched by a tree, pale as a ghost and shaking so badly he couldn't even hold his flashlight steady. A few seconds later, Aaron stumbled out behind me, eyes wide and glassy, and Greg collapsed right after, clutching his side, sobbing without sound. None of us spoke. We didn't need to. We just bolted into the tree line, hiding behind the nearest pines as if the shadows could protect us. From there, we could still see the dark slit in the rock where we'd come from. It felt alive, like it was breathing. We heard faint noises echoing out from inside, scratching, a muffled shuffle, something wet dragging across stone. None of it sounded human. It took us a moment to realize Tommy hadn't come out. I remember the exact second it hit me. Michael looked around, counted us, and his face just dropped. We started yelling his name, first in confusion, then in panic. Each time our voices bounced back off the mountain, thinner and more desperate than before. We waited, God knows how long, calling again and again, hoping to hear his voice answer from inside. Nothing. The entrance stayed black. Nothing moved. Whatever those things were, they hadn't crossed the threshold. I think the light stopped them, the way they'd flinched from our lanterns inside. Maybe the sun was worse for them. That thought should have comforted me, but it didn't. It only made me think about Tommy, still somewhere in that darkness, maybe surrounded by them. We got closer, just a few steps from the mouth of the cave, our hearts pounding so loud it drowned everything else. Michael, shaking, grabbed the rope we'd left tied at the entrance and started pulling it toward him. At first, it gave a little resistance, as if caught on something deep inside. Then it came loose all at once. When he lifted the end into the light, we saw it, frayed and uneven, like it had been sliced clean through. No one said a word after that. We just stood there, staring at that black opening, unable to move, unable to breathe. I think that was the moment we all buried him, right there in front of that cave. We didn't have a coffin or a grave, but in our heads, it was over. Tommy wasn't just a friend, he was family. We'd grown up together, spent every summer side by side, and now he was gone. And there was nothing any of us could do about it. The grief hit me so hard I couldn't even cry. My chest felt hollow, like something had been carved out of me. For a long time, none of us said anything. We just stayed there, half hidden behind those trees, waiting for the sun to go down, terrified that if we turned our backs, something from that cave might follow. But Michael was the first to pull himself together. He said we had to leave while there was still daylight, that we had to go get help for Tommy. I think it was that sliver of hope that got us moving again, heading down the mountain as fast as we could. By the time we reached the ranger station, we looked half dead, covered in blood, mud, and scratches. They called for help, but no one believed what we said. The official story was that a bear attacked us inside the cave and we panicked, that Tommy got lost or trapped. The animal attack specialist looked at us like we were lab rats. I think both he and we knew damn well it hadn't been a bear or any other kind of animal. But he kept quiet. A rescue team went in as soon as the first light of dawn hit, and they found nothing but empty tunnels. And that's when the most inexplicable thing of all happened. They found Tommy, alive and without a single scratch, but in complete shock. They said he'd been found inside a crack in the ground, barely able to move. When we saw him, our relief was immense, but at the same time, there was this huge weight in our chests. It was like we'd all gone through something so traumatic there was no way to ever, truly, get over it. And back then, there weren't the kinds of support resources that exist today. Greg never spoke about it again. Michael moved away a few years later and stopped talking to us. Aaron joined the Navy, and I haven't heard from him since. I stayed in the area, though I've never gone near those mountains again. Tommy's parents got him help in Pennsylvania, and although I heard about him a couple years ago, I haven't heard anything since. I'm still the guy who survived a bear attack, but I know that thing wasn't a bear, or any other animal. I never again felt the urge to explore the mountains, and I just hope no one ever has to go through what we went through. I've always loved the forest. I grew up with my grandmother in West Virginia. She was a woman many called a witch, but that was just jealousy talking. My grandmother always preferred the company of trees over people, and from a young age, she learned to identify every plant and its properties. I barely ever got sick, and I remember there was always some kind of remedy, some cure that made life feel different, more meaningful. Like we were part of nature itself, more than other people were. I'm telling you this, so you understand that the forests and the mountains were always my grandmother's home, and eventually, they became mine too. I never feared them, but I always respected them, knowing they were part of an ecosystem I couldn't survive without. When she died, and I lost the only family I had left, I started spending more and more time in the woods. I eventually bought a cabin literally in the middle of nowhere. After just a few years living there in isolation, I knew every inch of the land around my home like the back of my hand. The rivers, the caves, the ancient twisted trees. As the years went by, I learned to recognize the forest through all 4 seasons, each with its own beauty and its own challenges. I also learned how to survive whatever came my way. Over time, I met people who, like me, sought refuge in the solitude of the forest. Good people, tired of the noise and lies of the cities, who just wanted a quiet life, far from government control, far from others. Some folks called them feral people, savages, drifters, feared by most. But that's not how I saw them. I saw in them a deep desire to live in peace, to exist in harmony with the rhythm of the earth. I got to know them slowly, one face at a time, one story by every campfire in the clearings. Sometimes they'd come to my cabin during storms, asking for shelter, Other times, we'd cross paths on the trails, exchanging supplies, plants, a few words. Over time, they accepted me as one of their own, even if I didn't live within their communities. But about 4 years ago, something started to change in the forest. At first, it was small things, barely noticeable signs that only someone who'd lived there for years would catch. Human footprints where no one should have been. Hardly anyone hiked in that area. It was too rough, too far from the popular trails. Burned out campfires full of trash, clearly made by people who didn't respect the woods. One night, around 11 p.m., I was reheating some leftovers when I heard a gunshot. It shook me to my core. After years of peace, I wasn't used to the violent crack of a firearm anymore. I swear, even the forest felt it. The air itself changed. It was like something profane had just happened. And I'm not just saying that out of instinct. The evidence was there too. The usual forest sounds stopped, replaced by something darker, something off. I stepped out onto the porch, trying to see if I could spot anything, but there was nothing to see. Just that heavy feeling that something had shifted. That shot felt like an omen, one we'd all quietly sensed coming. Something was on its way. I just didn't realize how bad it was. A few days later, I came across one of the communities I told you about, and that's when I heard about the disappearances. First, it was an old man who'd lived alone for years in a tent near the river. He used to join the others for meals, even though he stayed mostly on his own. When he hadn't shown up for 2 days, they went to check on him. But the tent was empty, and there was no sign of him. They thought maybe he'd died somewhere nearby and his body got lost in the thick vegetation. Maybe he'd gotten sick and wandered off. Maybe animals had gotten to him. But if it had been animals, there would have been traces. Then it was Silvana. She was one of the first people I'd met out there. She loved animals, could read their tracks like a language. She'd even once helped a lost bear cub reunite with its mother. When I heard she'd gone missing, it felt like something inside me fell into place in the worst possible way. We searched for her in silence, with the desperation of people looking for a family member. But we never found a thing. Some suggested maybe it had been animals, since she spent so much time around them. But none of us really believed that. The animals loved her gentleness, and if something had happened, there would have been evidence. Fear started to seep through the forest like fog on a winter morning. People stopped wandering far from their camps. Fires were kept smaller, so as not to draw unwanted attention. Then came 3 more disappearances. 2 men and a woman. I knew all of them. For weeks, the remaining members of the communities tried convincing themselves it was all just accidents. It was winter, after all. Survival was tougher that time of year. It was possible, sure. We all loved the forest, but we also knew how treacherous it could be. One wrong step, and you could vanish forever. But something in my gut told me there was more to it. I could see the same thought reflected in their eyes. Even the forest itself seemed to mourn those people. It's hard to explain, but we could feel its grief. Then, one cold day, late November, I found out the truth. I'd gone out early, with the mist still covering the valleys, searching for a rare herb that only grew in the wettest parts of the woods, along an old hunting trail I barely ever visited. In all the years I'd lived there, I'd only been in that area twice before. Both times looking for that same plant. It was a long walk from my cabin, so I tried to move fast to make it back before dark. I hadn't been there more than 30 minutes when I heard voices in the distance. At first, they were just muffled sounds, men's voices, coming from a clearing below where I stood. I crept closer, not sure why I was so scared, but instinct told me I was about to see something terrible. I wasn't wrong. Through the thick brush, I saw them. 4 men, hooded, dressed in dark clothes, shotguns slung over their shoulders. They moved with a cold precision, like they'd done this before. 2 of them had their backs to me, 2 were facing my direction, but I was hidden and far enough away to stay unseen. They were holding something, but I couldn't tell what it was until they tossed it into a pit in the ground. That's when I realized it was a body. For a moment, time froze. Then I heard one of them crack a joke, making the others laugh. They were enjoying it. I felt sick. My legs moved on their own, backing away slowly, until I saw him. There was a 5th man, standing off in the distance, between the trees. He wasn't wearing a hood. I could see his face clearly, and he could see mine. He didn't move, just stared at me, with this faint smile. Not surprised, but entertained. And he was amused by my fear. Everything happened fast. I stumbled backward, hitting the ground hard, making enough noise to draw the others' attention. They turned toward me immediately, their posture changing. They were ready to hunt. But the man without the hood raised his hand, signaling them to stop. He said something I couldn't make out completely, but I caught one sentence, that I wasn't one of the drifters. I didn't wait around to hear more. I ran for my life. I ran until my chest burned and my throat felt like it was being cut open by the cold air. The winter terrain was brutal, and I had to stop several times to catch my breath. I didn't know if they were following me, but I knew they'd seen me, and that meant I had to act fast. When I finally reached the part of the forest I knew well, I hid inside a cave and called the authorities using my satellite phone. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number. I told them everything, from the exact location to what I'd witnessed. They said they'd send a patrol. Hours later, I got a call back saying they'd found nothing, except that the ground had been freshly dug up. I asked if they were bringing in dogs to search for bodies, but I never got an answer. They just said the investigation would continue, but I already knew better. No one cares about the people who live off the grid. Not long ago, I found out the case had been closed. No arrests, no suspects questioned. They just told me we were safe now, because the men had left the area. And it's true that no one else has disappeared since then. But the silence they left behind is worse than fear itself. The forests of this country are full of people like them. They didn't stop. They just moved on, free to do it all over again somewhere else without ever facing a single consequence. Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're exploring 3 terrifying stories that took place in the Appalachian Mountains during one of my absolute favorite natural phenomena: thunderstorms. I've been wanting to make a video on this topic for a while now, but I decided to wait and post it today for 2 main reasons. First, October and thunderstorms are the perfect combination. Second, well, it's my birthday, so it just felt like the right time. Thank you so much for being here and for choosing to support this channel. I truly hope you enjoy this video as much as I enjoyed reading and putting these stories together. If you have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. What I'm about to tell you happened to me last year, around the middle of October. But before I dive into what actually went down, I just need to give you a little context about why I was even in a place that isolated in the first place. The reason I'm pointing this out is because everything happened during about 2 weeks of massive storms. It rained all day. It rained all night. And this exact week this year, it's been the same way. It hasn't stopped raining or thundering. And I don't really know why, but this weather dragged me right back to that time, and I figured maybe it was time to finally talk about it. Basically, I lived with my parents until I started working in another state, and finally got a little bit of freedom. But about 1.5 years after working there, I ended up getting into a fight with a coworker, and we both got fired. Let me just make it clear. It wasn't entirely my fault. Of course, it was wrong to punch someone at work. It was childish not to control my emotions. But I swear I had reached a point where I just couldn't take it anymore. He was the kind of guy who had been harassing me since day one. He'd pull pranks on me, talk shit about me, mock me. I had never even given him a reason to act that way. We had never talked about anything that could have triggered some weird reaction, and I never treated him badly. But for whatever reason, he developed some kind of obsession with me and wouldn't leave me alone. So after punching him and us getting into a fight right there in the office, we both ended up without jobs. With no real prospects of finding something new right away, I had to move back in with my parents. It was supposed to be temporary, just long enough to get back on my feet and figure something out. But the months kept dragging on and nothing came up that would actually allow me to leave. And the thing is, once you've lived on your own and had your independence, moving back in with your parents is honestly one of the worst things that can happen to a person. One day, I was having coffee with an old high school friend, and he picked up on how miserable I was. That's when he told me about this cabin he owned, right in the middle of the woods, where he usually spent his summers. He'd only go there once a year and stay for 3 months. He basically offered me the place for the winter months, rent-free. All he asked in return was that I kept the place in shape while I was there. I hesitated a little at the idea of being in the middle of nowhere, but at least I could drive right up to the cabin. And like I said, I was desperate. I remember leaving that coffee shop with this rush of excitement, like for the first time in a while, I had a way out. I even walked home in pouring rain, not even caring about getting soaked. 4 days later, I was leaving my parents' house with the car packed and headed straight to the cabin. I had thought about waiting for the storm to calm down a bit, because driving through the woods with low visibility wasn't exactly safe. But the forecast said the storm wasn't going to let up for at least another week, so I figured it was better to just go. Another week trapped in that house with controlling parents, knowing I had an alternative, would have been unbearable. So yeah, 4 days after being handed that escape, I was on the road, driving toward the cabin. The trip would take about 2.5 hours, and since visibility was low and I had to take it slow, I left early in the morning. The road was tough, winding through nothing but forest, and for about an hour I didn't see a single sign of life except for a few isolated places that hinted someone might live out there. When I finally arrived, I couldn't believe how incredible the cabin was. It wasn't nearly as small as I had imagined, and it was fully ready to live in. I can't even explain the rush of pure excitement I felt that first week. I was free from my parents' control, free from that suffocating job, and for the first time in my life, it felt like the forest was giving me a clean slate. Maybe the storm was some kind of sign, a moment of chaos before things finally settled. I was convinced of it. I developed this little routine during that first week, spending my days between exploring the inside of the cabin and wandering around just outside whenever the rain softened enough to actually see the forest. At night, I'd light the fireplace, crack one of the windows open, and just soak in the darkness of the woods, the sound of the storm, and the crackle of the fire. I swear I'd never felt that kind of calm before. It got to the point where I was actually looking forward to nightfall just to hear those sounds. But obviously, the last thing you should ever do out there is keep the windows open at night in the middle of nowhere. The sound was so soothing that one night I actually fell asleep on the couch with the window wide open right above me. I woke up around 4 a.m. to what sounded like something breaking, like glass shattering. And that's when I saw something that froze me to the core. The fireplace was still burning, so its light cast this flickering glow across the floor. And right there, cutting through that glow, were footprints. Footprints I knew weren't mine. They had a clear direction, starting right at the couch where I had been sleeping, which meant whoever or whatever came in through the window had climbed in right above me. The thought alone sent a kind of fear through me that I'd never felt before. The footprints went toward the fireplace, then toward the smaller couch pushed up against the other window. Whoever had entered had sat there, watching me sleep. Another thought that made my stomach drop. Then the footprints led to the kitchen, the direction of the sound that had woken me up. I snapped out of the initial shock just enough to feel that heavy, unmistakable sensation that someone was still inside with me. I crept toward the fireplace, grabbed the sharpest tool I could find, and crouched in the corner, waiting. That's when I started noticing even more details that made my skin crawl. The footprints were bare, but the shape wasn't normal. They looked warped, twisted. And from the kitchen I could hear this breathing, quick and shallow, mixed with what sounded like a whimper. It was like someone crying, but it wasn't human crying. Not really. I shifted my weight, because my legs were going numb. And without realizing it, I slipped and hit my back against the wall. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough. The breathing stopped, and in the middle of the storm outside, there was this heavy silence filling the cabin, like it was swallowing every bit of sound except the rain and thunder. Then it happened too fast for my brain to keep up. Something, or someone, shot out of the kitchen into the living room and leapt through the window. It was so fast, I barely had time to react. And I swear to God, I had never felt terror like that in my life. It wasn't running upright like a normal person. Or at least, not completely. Its back was arched in this way that reminded me of someone really old. But there's no way someone that old could move like that. That speed, that agility, it wasn't right. It took me several seconds just to process what had happened. But when I finally managed to snap out of it, I ran to the window and slammed it shut. That's when I saw it. In the middle of the darkness, between the trees, two glowing eyes were staring right at me. I locked every window, every shutter. The kitchen was a mess. Two glasses shattered on the floor, and in one of them there was this weird, black, sticky residue. I have no idea what the hell that was. But I spent the entire night on edge, cleaning up everything, wiping away the muddy footprints from the floor, trying to hold myself together. By the time the sun came up, the cabin was spotless, and all my bags were lined up by the door, ready to get the hell out of there. Of course, I told my friend everything, but I honestly don't think he really believes me. All he said was that he'd never seen anything like that out there, but he'd keep an eye out. To this day, I have no idea what I saw that night, but it was without a doubt the most terrifying night of my life. It's funny how clear that night still feels to me, even though it's been, 3 autumns now? Must have been mid-October, because the trees up here on the ridge had already gone that deep burnt orange and brown, and you could smell the wood smoke from miles off. We'd had a long stretch of dry days, and when the forecast said a thunderstorm was rolling through, I remember feeling weirdly excited, like a kid again. I've always loved storms. It was something I inherited from my mother. Whenever there was a storm, she was absolutely captivated. She'd stop everything she was doing just to absorb the sound. I remember sitting with her many times doing the same thing. And because of that, whenever there was a storm, I not only loved listening to it, but also felt that warm, cozy sense of nostalgia. Those childhood days when the only worry was playing. It was definitely something I passed on to my kids. Ellie was 9 back then, and Sam had just turned 7. Both of them had that same look in their eyes when they heard thunder, like it was Christmas morning. My wife, Marla, hated it, said storms made her anxious. Anyway, we live way out deep in the Appalachians. Not quite West Virginia, not quite Tennessee, but somewhere in that messy in-between where the roads turn to gravel, and you lose cell signal after the second turn. I'm not exaggerating. That's really how it is out here. Our nearest neighbor's about 5 minutes away by car, maybe more when the road's washed out. We were lucky enough to inherit this house from my parents, who unfortunately both passed away quite young. But the house itself was perfect, ideal for raising our kids. Both Marla and I wanted to bring them up surrounded by nature and far from the chaos of the cities. That night, the sky had been heavy all day. That kind of weird yellow-gray color you get before a storm. Around 8, the wind picked up and the first thunder rumbled across the ridge. The kids came running into the kitchen all smiles, begging to sit out on the back porch to watch it roll in. So we bundled up in hoodies and ran outside just as the first fat drops started to fall. The porch light buzzed, the screen door slammed, and the smell of rain hit. That damp, cold, earthy smell that always means fall's really here. It's definitely one of the best smells in life. Now, the back porch overlooks a big slope down into the woods. Beyond that, nothing but darkness and trees that go for miles. I had my old radio playing low, The kind that still picks up stations from God knows where when the air's right. And we just sat there. Me, Sam, and Ellie. Listening to thunder crack and roll like it was crawling over the mountains. My wife stayed inside, curled up by the fireplace in her favorite reading spot. At some point, lightning flashed bright enough to light up the whole yard. And Ellie pointed, dead serious, out toward the tree line. "Dad, someone's out there." I laughed at first. I mean, it's dark. The rain's playing tricks on your eyes, right? But then another flash hit, and this time I saw something. A shape. I couldn't tell what it was, and I thought it might have just been a tree or a trunk with an odd shape. But I looked closer, fixed my eyes on the spot. And then I saw it again. Looked like a person. Standing still, half hidden by one of the trees at the bottom of the hill. My stomach kinda dropped. If it really was someone, and they'd been watching us, they'd probably realized we'd seen them. The kids started pointing right in that direction, and I kept staring for a long while. I told the kids to go inside and turn on the back floodlights. They didn't argue, just scrambled in through the screen door. I stayed put, waiting. The lights came on, bright white cutting through the rain. But there wasn't anybody there anymore. Just empty yard and wet grass bending in the wind. Which meant it wasn't just a weirdly shaped trunk. It was something capable of moving. And scarier than seeing it, there was the fact that it had been there moments before. But now I didn't know where it was. Didn't know if it had gone away or come closer. I told myself it was probably an animal. Hell, maybe even a deer standing weird. Nobody had ever come that close to the house before, but plenty of deer had, so that had to be the explanation. My wife had always loved animals, and sometimes they'd wander closer when she was around. Maybe it was a scared animal looking for shelter from the storm. But I still locked up every door in that house, front and back, and told Marla what we'd seen. I added that we should stay alert, but that there wasn't much reason to think something was wrong. Whatever it was, it had gone away. I felt bad lying to her like that, but I didn't want to ruin the night without a good reason. We settled in for the night, storm still pounding the roof. Watched some dumb Halloween movie with the kids till about 10. Eventually, we got them to bed, or tried to. Not 15 minutes later, Sam came out of his room pale as paper. Said someone was knocking on his window. My whole body tensed, and Marla's face went petrified. Now, you gotta understand. His window faces the woods side of the house. No porch. No easy way to reach it. Meaning no one could possibly just peek in or knock on it. Maybe he was still scared from what he'd seen outside and was making it up just so he wouldn't have to sleep alone. Either way, I wasn't going to ignore what he'd just told me. So I went upstairs to his room. I took the flashlight with me, since by that point the power had already gone out. But when I got to his room, I was absolutely horrified. Lightning flashed again, and for a split second, I swear I saw a man's face. Just a shape. But it was there, right against the glass. I yelled, grabbed my old man's gun, and tore out the back door before Marla could even stop me. Rain coming down sideways, thunder so loud it shook the siding. I ran around to the side, where Sam's room was, but there was nobody there. I stood there for a long moment, looking around, trying to figure out where he'd gone, how he'd even managed to look in through the window. But when I turned toward the front, I saw movement. A man, wearing a hooded coat, slipping around the corner of the house. I ran after him, feet sliding in the mud, heart hammering in my throat. I was obviously terrified, but I wasn't about to let him lay a hand on my family. But by the time I rounded the corner, gone. Just the wind and the sound of the rain. That night, we all stayed in the same room. Marla and I awake, listening for any noise. The kids were in our bed, all of us pretending to sleep, but really just waiting for another knock, another flash, another sound. But nothing else happened. Morning came, and with it, the storm calmed down. For a good 2 weeks afterward, we were all pretty tense. We installed security cameras around the property and reinforced the kids' bedroom windows. But nothing ever happened again. We never saw any man, and we have no idea what he wanted. It's strange how something that shattered my life still smells the same when I think about it. Wet leaves, cold metal, that sharp electrical bite in the air right before a storm breaks. I can close my eyes, and I'm right back there. 15, pissed off at the world, half-packed boots not walking straight into the worst night of my life. Everything I'm about to tell you happened more than 30 years ago, but it changed me forever. Especially the way I react to thunderstorms. Back then, my parents were dirt poor. Hell, everyone in that tiny mountain town was. Poor doesn't even cover it. It was straight up miserable. No real jobs, just endless days working yourself to the bone for scraps. My family wasn't any different. And I guess that's part of why everything went down the way it did that night. It was pouring harder than I'd ever seen. Thunder cracked like it was splitting the sky in half, shaking the paper-thin walls of the piece of shit house we called home. Calling it a house was generous. Parts of it might as well have been outdoors. Rain leaked in through the ceiling. Cold wind slipped through holes. And every storm felt like a fight to keep warm and dry. My dad had just come home from work, pissed off like always, ready to unload on me and my mom. I could tell it was going to be bad the second he stepped inside. There was a way he moved, the way he yanked off his boots, that meant he needed to break something. That night, I was done. Tired to the bone. I wasn't going to let him take it out on me again, and I damn sure wasn't going to watch him lay a hand on her. I told him he was a coward, that none of it was our fault, that he didn't have the right to dump all his shit on us. He let me finish talking. Then the slap came hard and fast. My face lit up with pain, but I didn't cry. I snapped. I shoved him back with everything I had. He stumbled, lost his balance, and smashed the back of his head against the corner of a piece of furniture. Panic hit me like a wave. I thought I'd killed him, but he was still breathing. My mom and I dragged him to the bed. I couldn't handle everything burning inside me. Anger, fear, guilt. It was too much. So I threw the front door open and just ran. We lived out in the Appalachian Mountains in Pennsylvania. Running off in the middle of the night wasn't new for me. but doing it during a storm like that was. I sprinted through the fields, rain soaking through every layer, the sky lighting up in white flashes. Eventually, I got scared of getting hit by lightning, so I stopped under a cluster of trees that offered a bit of cover. I was drenched, shivering, but burning up inside. Without thinking, I let out this scream, raw and furious. I lived in a place where I could scream all I wanted. First, it was almost impossible for anyone to actually hear me, especially with the storm roaring like that. And second, it was night. Nobody went into the woods after dark. Not ever. And definitely not after hearing a scream. I was dead wrong. Not even 30 seconds after the scream, I felt something move on my right. I turned, and there was a man. Hood pulled low, holding something long in his hand. It looked like a baseball bat. And the second I saw him, I just knew. He meant me harm. I tried to step back, but he lunged forward and swung. Then, everything went black. When I came to, my head was pounding. It was dark, and the air smelled foul, mold, rot, something sour. I knew exactly where I was. Not far from my house, there were these old ruins everyone called cursed. People said ghosts roamed there. But what scared us more than ghosts was the fact that it was falling apart. The only thing still standing was the shell of an old church. I'd been there before, with some friends. My wrists burned like fire. I realized my hands were tied behind my back with some kind of rough rope. It dug into my skin, too tight. Like whoever did it wanted to make sure I didn't move an inch. Then I heard a voice, and realized I wasn't alone. I couldn't make out what was being said, just the tone. I knew that voice, which made it worse. The door creaked open, slow and heavy, and I heard footsteps fading away. Then daylight slammed into me like a punch. It burned through my eyes, sharp and blinding, and my head felt like it was splitting in two. I don't know how long I stayed there after that. Soaked to the bone, teeth chattering, every muscle locked up. The silence pressed down on me, thick and cold. Nobody came back. It was just me, tied up, waiting for something I couldn't even name. I honestly thought I was gonna die there. Nobody ever came through that area, not unless it was some hunter cutting through the woods, and even that was rare. And it sure as hell wasn't hunting season. Outside, the storm was still raging, pounding against the broken walls like it wanted in. I remember lying there, tied up, soaked, and freezing, knowing no one was coming. Then, finally, the door opened again and a man stepped inside. For a split second, I felt pure terror, and then relief. It was Mr. Buck, our closest neighbor. He was the kind of guy who'd give us potatoes when we couldn't afford dinner. For a heartbeat, I thought maybe he'd been the one who took me. But the panic in his voice killed that thought fast. He was there to help. He rushed to untie me, asking questions I couldn't even process. Who did this? What happened? How long had I been there? I couldn't answer. I just kept whispering, "Thank you," and begging him to hurry. Then the door slammed open again. Another man, the same shadow I'd seen in the woods, was there. The second he saw us, he bolted. Mr. Buck almost ran after him, but I grabbed him with what little strength I had left. I begged without words, and he stayed. He took me home. My mom was sobbing when she saw me, wrapping herself around me like she could keep me from vanishing again. My dad started to raise his voice, until Buck shut him down with a look and a few hard words. There was no police report, no search. No one even knocked on a door to ask what happened. People around there didn't want to get involved. They didn't want trouble. They didn't want their names in anything. So everyone just went quiet, like it never happened. And that was it. Nothing was done. That was it. My parents died young. The house is still there, rotting like it always did. I only went back once, to help Mr. Buck when he was old and alone. One time I asked him how he'd even managed to find me, and he said my mom had shown up at his door, crying and begging for help. My dad couldn't have cared less if I lived or died, so she went to the only person she trusted. Buck told me he'd spent the whole damn night out there searching for me, wandering through the woods with nothing to go on. Any tracks that might have been there were already washed away by the storm. He said he only passed by the old ruins by sheer luck. For a second, he figured maybe I'd run off and taken shelter in the church. He never once thought I'd been kidnapped. I asked him if he had any idea who it was. He said he had his suspicions, and if he was right, that man had been rotting in the ground for a long time. After he passed, whatever tie I still had to that place died with him. I've never gone back. I don't plan to. Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we've got 7 brand new stories. Ones that have never been shared here on the channel before. I'm so excited to finally bring you this special episode on one of my favorite nights of the entire year, Halloween. Tonight isn't just about candy and costumes. It's about the things that hide in the dark when no one's around. Hope you have a terrifying night, and an even harder time sleeping after. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. I confess I don't really know how to put into words what I'm going through right now, but I promise I'll do my best. Sorry if it comes out a little awkward or confused. The truth is, I'm going through something I don't even know whether I believe or how it's possible. And more than anything, I don't know what to do, and I need help understanding. I want to know if there are people who've experienced something similar and how they dealt with it. Another thing is that I wasn't the only one who went through this. My sister went through it too, as well as some kids who lived with us in that part of the country. But my sister and I haven't spoken in years, and the other kids from around here each went their own way. I have no idea where they might be today. It all happened more than 30 years ago. When I was 7, I spent most afternoons outside until the light went bad. We lived in a small house tucked into the lower Appalachians. Nothing fancy. Both of my parents worked the land, growing vegetables and raising animals. Most people in the area did exactly the same thing. The kids would gather in the streets and end up playing on their own. I don't know exactly when I first saw him, and there are a lot of details from that time I can't fully remember. But there are other things I recall as if they happened yesterday, not 30 years ago. Elijah was the kid who lived in the woods. That's how I remember him. Always half leaning against an oak or crouched on a fallen log, hair sticking up like he'd stuck his finger in a socket. He wore the same ratty overalls for months, even in summer. And he smelled like dirt and cigarette smoke, though I knew he didn't smoke. He had a grin that never reached his eyes and a habit of making people fall down for fun. On top of that, he looked sick most of the time, pale and wiry like he wasn't eating right. He should have been the kind of kid everyone else picked on, the one who got bullied. But Elijah never let that happen. Out of all of us, he was the leader. He was the rebel, full of personality, like he always knew more than any of us. And like I said, nothing made him happier than seeing someone hurt, or being the one to do it. At first, it was harmless stuff. He'd wait by the trail and tell us to race him, then shove us just as we reached the top of the stone wall. We'd tumble down, and he'd laugh so hard he threw his head back. Once, he took my sister's doll, smeared mud on its face, then dared her to grab it back. She did, and the head popped off. We all laughed, because you did what Elijah wanted. You wanted him to like you. It was around that time that my relationship with my sister started to fall apart. Elijah was especially cruel to her, mostly because she was small and cried easily. Not once did I take her side or defend her. I was terrified he'd turn on me next, so I laughed along with the others, sometimes even louder. I know I deserve the distance she's kept from me. Over time, his jokes escalated and got meaner. One time, he tried to set fire to our house while my sister and my dad were still inside. Even then, I couldn't bring myself to say it was Elijah. I played dumb, swore I had no idea what had happened. They made it out okay, but my sister burned her hand, and she still carries the scar to this day. But after that, I got cautious. I stopped going to the trail alone. I watched the woods with my chin tucked into my jacket like I was holding myself together just to keep an eye out. Elijah still came by, walking past the fence and calling my name like nothing was wrong. I asked my mom once who Elijah's mother was, if she knew the house where they lived. I was shocked when she told me she didn't know any Elijah. Our community was too small for that. But she didn't push the subject, and neither did I. She was worn out from working the fields, and I let it drop. One day Elijah led me to a clearing I'd never seen before. It was frighteningly close to our house, but somehow I had never noticed it. The place unsettled me, so I tried to play it off and told him there was a cooler spot up ahead, that we should go there instead. He got curious and followed. But maybe 2 minutes later I looked back, and I was alone. Elijah was gone. My stomach dropped. I wasn't allowed to be walking in the woods by myself. Then I remembered. It was Elijah. He was probably crouched behind a tree, waiting to jump out and scare me. So I braced myself and started back toward the house, tense the whole way, expecting him to leap out at any moment. But when I circled back to the spot where we'd first been, there he was, just sitting on the ground. His face was miserable, and for a second, I actually felt sorry for him. I asked if he was okay, and why he hadn't followed me. He just said he couldn't go any farther from our house than that distance, I didn't understand what he meant, so I pushed a little. He finally looked me dead in the eye and told me never to ask him about it again. And, as you can imagine, that's exactly what I did. After that, Elijah started showing up less. The last time I saw him, I was 9. He shoved a kid off his bike, and the boy had to be taken to the hospital. Back then, the nearest hospital was far, and hardly anyone around had a car, so it turned into a huge scandal in the village. The boy had fallen close to our house, so my mom came straight to me for answers. I knew this time it was serious, that Elijah wasn't just mean, he was dangerous. That night, for the first time, I told her everything. For once, she actually listened. She didn't brush me off, didn't tell me I was imagining things. Instead, she had a long, quiet talk with my dad later that night. A few days after, a woman came to our house. She burned some objects in the yard, small things I didn't recognize. I asked my mom what she was doing, and she told me they were just old items that had bugs in them, that it was better to get rid of them before we ended up with an infestation. I was 9, so I believed her. I didn't think much more about it. Then Elijah just stopped coming around. I don't think I ever saw him again. Sometimes, I'd wander into the woods and swear I felt like I wasn't alone. Like, he might step out from behind a tree at any second. But he never did. I felt a kind of loss, because for all his cruelty, he'd been one of the only friends I had. But more than that, I felt relief. And underneath it all was a constant fear that he might return. I asked my mom if she knew anything, and she told me his family had moved away, that I wouldn't be seeing him again. Time went on. Because of my cowardice, my sister and I never had a real relationship. Later, when we were teenagers, I tried to make peace with her, but she just told me it was too late, that I'd never been a brother to her. I don't blame her. When we finally left our parents' house, I lost contact with her completely. The only news I ever got came through my parents. That she'd married, that she had a child, that she had a good job, and was living well. But I never knew more than that. Both my parents passed away last year, only a few days apart. It was the first time I'd seen my sister in years at the funeral. Even then, she kept her distance, and so did I. She told me there were a few things from the house she wanted, but the rest was mine. For almost a year, I didn't step foot in that house. Then, 2 months ago, I decided it was time to start cleaning it out, preparing to sell it. I had no idea how many boxes were in the basement. I thought it'd be quick work, but it's been dragging on. And I'm only telling you all this now because 3 days ago I found a box filled with photographs of people I didn't recognize. At first I assumed they were distant relatives, but then I realized they were the previous owners of the property, before my parents bought it. I never knew much about the story, only that my parents had gotten the land for next to nothing, because nobody else wanted it. There were even people in the village who wouldn't come to our house when I was a kid. My mom always brushed it off as old superstition. But then, buried among those photographs, I saw him. It was Elijah, lying in a bed, sickly and mean-looking. Exactly as I remembered him. I couldn't understand why we would have a photo of Elijah in our house. So I started digging through old property records. And that's when I found out the truth. Elijah had lived in that house before my parents bought it. Worse, he died there, in a fire. He'd been a sick child, kept inside most of the time. One day the fire started, and he never made it out. I've spent the last 3 days in shock. I don't know what to think. I called my sister and told her everything. She listened quietly, then said she'd been through enough and refused to put herself through that again. She didn't want to hear any more about it, and she told me not to call her again. I honestly don't know what to believe or what to do. I've reached out to a university professor who specializes in the modern history of this region, hoping he can shed some light. But right now, I'm just lost. I don't even know how to start explaining this, because every time I try to tell someone, I sound like I'm exaggerating, like I'm trying to make something ordinary sound terrifying. But that's not what this is. My wife and I live in a small cabin in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, surrounded by thick woods that seem to breathe at night. I promise I'm not exaggerating. These forests are truly alive, and anyone who spends a little time here, or who can notice small details, knows what I mean. It's the kind of place that feels cut off from everything, quiet in a way that makes you notice every sound, every shift in the air. Not that the whole area where we live is like this. There's a small village nearby with the essentials for people to live comfortably. But here, where we are, it's completely isolated. Unlike most people who choose to live this way, in our case, it wasn't a choice. A year after my wife and I got married, I was diagnosed with leukemia. And since then, we've lost almost everything. My wife had a good job, and we were able to save a little. But with treatments and appointments, we were practically driven to poverty. Living here was the only solution to not end up living under a bridge. Still, even though we both live difficult lives, my wife has this gift for making everything better, finding every positive point and pulling it to the maximum. And honestly, she's pulled me out of depression more than once. So, even though living so isolated wasn't really a choice, it wasn't absolutely terrible, and we did our best to make it work. We were even finding a bit of happiness. But about a month ago, everything changed. Since September 17th of this year, everything we'd been working towards started to fall apart. That was the first night we heard it. A whistle, coming from outside the house. It was around 10:30 p.m. We were watching a show on my laptop in bed when it came. Faint at first. Just 3 soft notes, stretched out like someone trying to get the attention of a dog far away. I remember pausing the video and looking at her. We both listened. It came again, a little louder. The same slow whistle, like a tune that had been stripped of rhythm. At first, there was no reason to panic. It really could have been someone calling their dog or maybe a familiar neighbor. It was strange because of how isolated we are. But it wasn't impossible that someone might be walking through the forest. The strangest part was that it was nighttime, and locals almost never go into the woods after dark. Still, I got up and checked the porch, the yard, even went to the tree line with my flashlight. I wouldn't go any further than that. But I didn't hear anything else, didn't see any movement, so I went back to bed. The next night, it came again. And by the end of that week, the whistle was constant. Not all day, but every night, without fail. It always started around the same time and lasted for hours. Sometimes it would drift closer, almost like whoever was doing it knew exactly where our bedroom was, as if they were right outside the window, even though our bedroom window is on the second floor and there's no balcony. I tried convincing myself it was a prank, that maybe some local kid had found a way to mess with us. It was definitely persistent. But in my head, it had to be someone messing around. I even joked about it at first, though I could tell my wife wasn't amused. She's always been more sensitive to the forest, sometimes noticing an animal before I do, or sensing when the weather was about to change. Small details that might seem insignificant, but have always shown me she has much better intuition than I do, and that I should listen when she talks about the woods. As the nights went on, the whistles started to get under her skin. In a way I didn't want to admit, it was getting under mine too. There was something about it that didn't sound random. It wasn't just noise. It was deliberate. Like it really was a person coming every night just to harass us. One night, it got bad. It was around 2 a.m, pitch black, and the whistle woke me up. This time, it wasn't coming from outside the house. It was inside. At least that's what my brain told me. It was so close it felt like it was in the same room. I sat up and held my breath. The sound came again. Clear and sharp from the direction of the closet. My wife whispered my name, asking if I heard it. Her voice was trembling. I didn't even answer. Just grabbed her hand and stared at the closet door, waiting for it to happen again. It did. 3 long, slow notes. I could see the handle of the closet door, motionless, but the sound came from behind it. I swear it did. I couldn't bring myself to open it. We just sat there, frozen, listening, until it stopped. The next morning, my wife told me she was sure it had come from inside the bedroom. She said it with such conviction that for the first time, I didn't even try to rationalize it. I just nodded. From that point on, things got worse. The whistle came earlier and louder, sometimes from behind the house, sometimes right by the porch steps. I bought cameras, motion lights, even tied fishing line across the path that led from the woods to our yard, so I'd know if someone passed through. I spent money I didn't have on all that. But every morning, everything was untouched, and there was nothing on the footage. Nothing moved. We started losing sleep. I could see her falling apart from exhaustion, from fear, and I wasn't doing much better. Every sound made us tense up. Even during the day, we'd catch ourselves listening, waiting for that sound to start again. 2 weeks ago, we called the police. It felt ridiculous, trying to explain over the phone that we were being harassed by a whistle. But the dispatcher didn't laugh. She sent someone out. When the 2 officers arrived, one of them looked like he'd been doing this job forever. Older guy, quiet, didn't say much. I told them everything, from the beginning. When I mentioned the whistle coming from inside the house, the younger officer tried to hide a smirk, but the older one didn't even blink. He just stared at me, and for a moment his face went pale, like something I said hit too close to home. He asked what day it started. I told him, September 17th. He didn't say another word after that. just nodded slowly and stepped outside, standing there for a long time, scanning the tree line. They took a report, said they'd patrol the area a few nights, and that was that. But I knew from the look on that man's face that something about what I told him wasn't new to him. It was like he already knew the story. That night, the whistle came back, and I swear it was louder. I sat on the edge of the bed, gun in hand, listening. My wife was buried under the covers, barely breathing. I feel like what's happening isn't just affecting her mentally, it's affecting her physically, like it's draining her energy. It's more than just emotional exhaustion. But when I ask if she's okay, she forces a smile and says she is. But I can feel the tension in her body, the silent panic. The whistle came from the porch this time, slow and mocking. And then it stopped. Silence for maybe 30 seconds. Then it started again, from the back of the house. It was moving. I went to the window, but didn't see anything. Just the faint reflection of my own face, pale and sleepless. I stayed there for hours, until the sky turned gray. At some point, I looked out the window again. And that was the first time I actually saw something. And honestly, I wish I hadn't. It was this dark shape, like the shadow of a person, but moving, alive somehow. There was no light behind it, no reason for there to be a shadow at all, yet it was there. Then what looked like its head turned, and even though it didn't have eyes, I knew, without a doubt, it was looking right at me. I stumbled back, tripped over the rug, and hit the floor hard. My wife asked what happened, if I was okay. All I managed to say was that I got spooked, that I thought I saw something, but must have been wrong. I had to be wrong. Because if I told her what I really saw, it would have made it real. Since then, I've stopped trying to prove anything. I turned off the cameras. I don't check the yard anymore. I just stay inside, waiting for the sound to come again, because it always does. Every single night. I've started to think that maybe it's not someone trying to scare us. Maybe it's not someone at all. Because I don't even understand what it could be. All I know is that the whistle hasn't stopped since that first night. I feel like it's going to get worse. And I'm especially afraid of Halloween night. Before all this, I didn't believe in anything. But now I feel like those stories about the veil between our world and the other getting thinner might have some truth to them. My grandmother used to tell me stories when I was a kid. What used to be just stories now echo in my skull like a bad omen. We're both desperate and don't know what to do. What I'm about to tell you happened last year, on Halloween night. Since then, it hasn't really stopped happening. Even though nothing truly bad has happened yet, I'm scared that this coming October 31st, something genuinely terrible might take place. Honestly, I was never the kind of person to believe in superstitions or forest creatures, but now, I don't know what to believe anymore. All I know is that I'm scared. I'm scared for myself, and especially for my parents. It was late October in West Virginia, and I had the house all to myself. My parents had driven down to visit my aunt in South Carolina for the week like they did every year around Halloween. I'd always hated Halloween, not because of the costumes or candy, but because of something that happened when I was 9. A neighbor, a kid I used to play with, did something so messed up to a stray cat that the image never really left me. Back then, it was common for cults to operate around here, and people would hurt animals. Even though I know it's much rarer these days, the idea that it could still be happening haunts me. Since then, Halloween had this dark, ugly feeling attached to it. I never celebrated it, never dressed up, never even opened the door to trick-or-treaters. At the time this happened, I wasn't living with my parents anymore. I lived in the city, but I used to come back often and spend a few weeks with them at the house. In the city, Halloween was a big deal, but out there, in such an isolated area, I doubted anyone would bother us. The house sat on the edge of the woods, a good 20-minute drive from the nearest town. No close neighbors, no streetlights. Just an old 2-story house surrounded by a tree line that always looked like it was hiding something. My parents had built their lives out here, loving the silence. For me, that silence always felt heavy. That's why I chose to move to an area with more people. Still, I liked feeling that isolation sometimes, which is why I often went back to stay with them. I liked experiencing that kind of quiet on my own terms, only when I decided I wanted it. I had spent most of the evening in the living room, scrolling through my phone with the TV on just to fill the space with some background noise. It was a little after 8 p.m. when I started noticing how quiet everything outside had gotten. Not unusual for this place, but different. The crickets weren't chirping, and the woods behind the house sounded dead. I know it sounds like a total cliché, and everyone says this kind of thing happens. But the truth is, ever since this happened a year ago, I've been obsessed with the weird stuff that goes on in this part of the country. The way everything goes quiet right before shit hits the fan is way too common. I don't know why it happens, but some people say animals go silent when there's a predator nearby. Honestly, that explanation makes a lot of sense to me, but even then, I'm still not sure what to think of it. At 10:17 p.m., the first thing happened. A loud beep from the security system. Rear motion sensor triggered. The back of the property. The cameras were old but still worked fine, so I pulled up the feed on my phone. Nothing. Just darkness and the faint outline of the tree line. I stepped outside to check the panel, my breath visible in the cold air. But there was no movement, no sound. So I reset the alarm and went back inside. Around 11:30, I heard it. A high-pitched whistle coming from somewhere near the trees. Sharp, clean, and way too deliberate to be the wind. Could it have been someone celebrating Halloween? Kids never trick-or-treated in this area. I forced myself to walk to the front door and open it. The porch light spilled out into the yard, lighting up the dirt driveway, the front fence, and a patch of trees. But once again, there was no one there and I didn't see any movement at all. The thing is, of course I'd heard plenty of legends about whistling in the forest. My grandparents and a few close friends who also grew up in those areas take that stuff really seriously. Any other night of the year, I would have just ignored the whistle. Even though I don't believe in that kind of thing, I usually don't let it get to me. But that Halloween night, my first thought was that someone was actually calling out. To make things worse, the doorbell was partially covered by a climbing plant. So anyone who didn't know the house, especially at night, probably wouldn't have even seen it. I even called out, asking if someone was there, but no one answered back. I told myself some teenager was probably messing around, but I couldn't ignore the way that whistle had crawled under my skin. I locked the door and turned off the TV. 10 minutes later, I got up to grab water from the kitchen. When I turned the corner, I saw it. A tall, thin figure standing just outside the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. Taller than any man I'd ever seen, dressed in all black from head to toe, face covered with a black mask. The only thing not black were the eyes. Yellow, narrow, snake-like. They locked on me through the glass. It wasn't some Halloween prank costume. It didn't look cheap. It didn't look like something you'd find in a store. My heart slammed so hard it hurt. I didn't even think. I bolted to my parents' bedroom, grabbed my dad's handgun from the safe, and ran back to the kitchen. But there was nothing there anymore. Beyond the glass, all I could see was the vast, endless darkness of the forest. I didn't sleep after that. I spent the entire night pacing through the house, checking the locks, turning on lights, walking past the windows again and again. Every creak made me flinch, but what kept replaying in my head was those eyes. I tried to convince myself it was just some idiot playing a prank, maybe someone from town trying to scare people out in the sticks. I really convinced myself it was just the darkness, that I'd seen it wrong, that I was just nervous. These days, people make insanely realistic masks anyway. The next day, I decided not to say anything to my parents. I was completely convinced it had just been some Halloween bullshit, and that we wouldn't have any problems. After all, whatever it was hadn't tried to get inside, and by morning, there were no footprints anywhere on the property. I convinced myself there was no reason to panic. The problem is, ever since that night, my parents have had several incidents where the alarm goes off almost always after 3 a.m., especially during certain times of the year. They barely get any sleep for weeks. They even replaced the alarm system, thinking it was a malfunction. They called the police, which is something almost unheard of around here. But the truth is, there's never any sign of anything. Neither of them has ever seen anyone or anything close to what I saw. And obviously, I'm not about to tell them I saw some creature with snake-like eyes. The cameras around the property never capture anything. Even when the alarm goes off, there's nothing there. What really scares me is that Halloween is coming around again, and I can't shake the feeling that things might get worse that night. I've been trying to convince my parents to spend Halloween somewhere else, but they keep insisting they want to stay home. I've always had this one ritual. Every Halloween I go out into the mountains, pack minimal gear, hike up to some remote spot, and spend the night alone. No phone bars, no other campers. Just me, the forest, the lookout cabin or tower I pick, and whatever the night brings. It started off as a way to face fear, to get comfortable being vulnerable. I've done it a few times. Each time there've been odd little things. Creaks, weird shadows, nights where the wind seems to know your name. But I've never been genuinely rattled. Until this year. To be honest, I don't even know what year this whole tradition of mine started. But I think I first heard about it at some random dinner with friends. Someone there was telling the story about how they had a kind of crazy friend who did it. I thought it was weird at the time too. But as I was driving home after that dinner, the idea kept buzzing in my head. And somehow I got obsessed with trying it myself. The first time was absolutely terrifying, but there was something beautiful in that fear I felt. And since that first experience, I gotta say, I've been hooked. I know it probably sounds kinda messed up to most of you, But hey, it makes me happy. We all do what we need to do to stay afloat in a world that sometimes feels like it's about to collapse on top of us. So, yeah. Even though some weird stuff has happened before, nothing like what went down the last time I did it. Last Halloween, almost a year ago, I chose a spot I'd heard about but never used before. A fire watch tower perched high up on a ridge in the southern Appalachians. One of those old cabins, or towers, built for forest fire lookouts back in the mid-20th century. The hike up in the late afternoon was crisp, leaves turning, air a little sharp. Typical for that time of year. I got there just before sunset, climbed the last rough switchbacks, dropped my pack, and got everything set up. The lookout had glass windows all around, panoramic views, also pretty typical for most of these places. At dusk, you could see the ridges rolling away into bluish shadows, and the forest closing in. I set up my sleeping bag in the small wood floor cabin that's connected to the tower structure, gathered some dry wood, started a fire in the metal ring outside, and cooked dinner on my little camp stove. I've always loved watching fire, especially the way it throws shadows around everything near it. I felt confident. I'd done this before. I knew the risks, and I felt ready. One thing I should probably say, I'm not someone who really believes in the supernatural. I mean, sure, I think there are things out there we don't understand, and maybe don't want to understand. But I don't buy into most of the legends and stories floating around about these mountains. I like reading about them, and I like trying to figure out if there's any truth to them. But I'm not someone who genuinely believes the stuff I'm reading. So, after dinner, I went back inside the lookout to grab some papers I'd printed and brought with me, and I started reading. A week or two before leaving, I'd done a bit of digging into local lore. I found this legend about the so-called Black Dog. According to Appalachian folklore, there's this big black dog, ghostly, kinda spectral, that shows up mostly at night on ridgelines and forest roads, often as an omen of misfortune or just a warning. Again, I didn't believe much of it, especially since everyone who claimed to have seen it told a different version, some of them wildly different. Still, I wanted to know more about the legend, and what better night than Halloween? Around 10 p.m., I got up to lock the door tight, make sure the fire I'd lit had burned out, and climbed into my sleeping bag. The sounds around me were completely soothing. The wind, the animals, the whole atmosphere was magical, and it quickly carried me off to sleep. Sometime around 2 a.m., I woke up, not sure why. The lookout was pitch black, and even the forest outside was dark as hell. Could barely see past the tree line. The wind had picked up, so I stood up to get a better look at the landscape around me. That's when I heard something. Maybe a thump. Though it was so quick and sudden that honestly, I'm not totally sure I really heard it. Then I heard it again. Another sound. It was subtle. I froze, looking around, trying to figure out what I'd just heard. I can't really explain what I felt, but I know I felt it. Like that noise didn't belong to everything else around me. The forest wasn't silent. There were plenty of sounds. But somehow, that one stuck out. Then I heard another thump. Louder this time. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the stairs below me or from the roof above, but it definitely sounded like something hitting metal. I thought maybe it was another person trying to use the lookout. These places kind of self-manage. You never know if someone else might show up. Still, it was weird, and honestly, a little terrifying. To think someone might be climbing up the stairs to join me in the middle of the night. I thought about opening the door, shouting into the dark that the place was taken, and asking whoever it was to leave. I really didn't want to share the space with some random person wandering around at that hour. After a short internal debate, I finally opened the door and stepped out onto the small balcony that overlooked the stairs. And that's when I saw it. No doubt about it. On the stairs was this huge black dog, massive, and at the same time kind of transparent, like it was just a reflection of a dog, or its shadow. It was looking right at me, even though I couldn't make out any eyes or facial expression. Then, while we were staring at each other, it suddenly bolted straight toward me. I did exactly the same. Ran for the lookout door, slammed it shut behind me, and locked it. My heart was pounding, mostly because I couldn't come up with a single logical explanation for what I'd just seen. The dog couldn't have been a ghost. I heard it climbing the stairs. But it also couldn't have been a real dog because its body wasn't solid. I could feel it right outside the door, just inches away. I could hear it walking, even breathing. This heavy, labored breathing. The whole night I stayed there, sitting against the door, like the weight of my body might somehow stop it from coming in. While I listened to its footsteps circling the lookout, I kept trying to come up with a logical reason for what I'd seen. Around 5:30 in the morning, I heard it walk down the stairs and disappear back into the woods. I was still panicking, with no idea what I'd actually seen. I wanted it to have just been a dog, no matter how big or scary, because at least that would have been something I could understand. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I knew that dog wasn't really a dog, not in the way we know them. I called a friend and asked him to come pick me up. Even though cars don't usually go up there, there's this old road, and if you've got a Jeep, you can make it pretty easily. To this day, I haven't told anyone about it. Not even him. I made up some story about someone harassing me and making me feel unsafe. He insisted I go to the cops, but come on. If I told the police what I actually saw, they'd probably try to lock me up in a psych ward or just laugh in my face. So, yeah. I'm telling this for the first time now, because Halloween's just a few days away, and I think for the first time in years, I'm just gonna stay home for the night. I have spent most of my life trying not to remember the autumn of 2001. Yet every October the air turns sharp and smells faintly of iron and smoke. And I find myself pulled back to that small cabin my family used to visit in the high folds of the Appalachian Mountains. A place that once seemed like a refuge, and now feels like a wound carved into the land itself, refusing to close. No matter how much therapy I do, no matter how many times I talk or write about it, it seems that no matter what I do, I can't close the wound. And I'm destined to die with this pain in my chest. I wish reality weren't like this, but it is. And maybe part of the healing process is learning to live with the pain. I don't even know anymore. My father had built that cabin years before I was born, believing that the solitude of the mountain would keep the world at bay, that the forest would cleanse us of everything artificial and cruel. But perhaps there are places that were never meant to hold families, places that feed on silence and memory. And our mistake was thinking that nature was ever gentle with those who lingered too long under its shadow. We would always go in mid-October when the leaves had begun their slow transformation into rust and gold, and the air carried that quiet hum that only dying things seem to know. I also want to apologize to anyone who is listening or reading the story if it seems a little unreal, or even written in a way that makes it seem unreal. I have written it so many times in my diary that it feels as though I have perfected the details, even the most insignificant things. It's as if it has become a protective mechanism, focusing on the smallest details, so I don't have to confront what really happened. I remember the road that wound endlessly upward, the tires crackling over gravel, and the sky thinning until it felt too close. And how my brother Eli sat beside me in the back seat, watching the tree line with a kind of stillness that didn't belong to a child, as if he recognized something waiting for him there. It was our last trip together, though none of us knew that yet. And maybe that is why every detail of that weekend has remained inside me, suspended, like a photograph I never wanted to look at again, but could never quite destroy. The cabin was older every year, its wood swollen from rain and years of neglect. And inside it smelled of ash, old pine, and something faintly sweet. Something that I could never identify, and that seemed to cling to our clothes even after we left. The first night, I remember the forest being utterly still. No wind, no insects. Only that enormous silence pressing against the windows, so heavy that even breathing felt intrusive. And I recall thinking that perhaps the mountain was holding its breath for us, waiting for us to notice how out of place we were. My brother seemed restless that evening, walking circles around the cabin's perimeter as if tracing something invisible. And my parents thought little of it. But there was a look in his eyes that unsettled me, an unfocused calmness, like he was listening to something only he could hear, something deep beneath the ground. That night I read him 3 stories to calm him, but they were old tales, stories about the mountains. And in a way I think they did calm him, yet they left me in an even greater heap of nerves. I think I knew that something was about to happen. The following day passed in that hazy rhythm of family ritual. The smell of smoke, the slow preparation of meals, my father chopping wood, my mother whistling softly as she went about the day's chores. And yet beneath all of it there was a quiet dissonance, a sense that something beneath the surface of our ordinary gestures was watching, patient and unseen. It was the following night that something happened. At first, I thought I had only dreamed it. I was convinced of it. But then I understood. I woke in the middle of the night, cold. A freezing cold that seemed to seep into my bones. And as my eyes adjusted to the room, I saw my brother at the window, staring at something outside. Something moving in a strange, shadowy way. I never saw its face because I genuinely thought I was dreaming. The next day, I didn't even ask him what had happened, afraid that it was real and that I would have to face it. When we returned home, the silence of the mountain came with us, lodged under our skin. Eli changed first. He began waking in the night, standing by the window for hours, his breath fogging the glass, staring toward the north, as if the mountains had followed him there. He became thinner, paler, and there was something about his stillness that unnerved me. It was as though he were trying to become invisible, to dissolve into that same quiet that had filled the cabin. My parents whispered about stress, about school, about the strange effects of growing up. But I knew that whatever had touched him in those woods was bad, really bad. Weeks passed before he vanished. And when he did, it was not sudden but almost expected, as if he had been slowly slipping away one layer at a time, until finally his absence became visible. My parents found the front door open at dawn, a trail of small footprints leading down the hill toward the river. And then, nothing. The search lasted days, and I remember the faces of men covered in mud and exhaustion, the smell of dogs and diesel, the hollow echo of my mother's voice calling a name that I knew already belonged to the trees. There's no point in asking me how I could feel all of this, how I could be so certain. Maybe it was because we were twins, and somehow communicated through something other than words. I don't really know. I only know that at the time, I felt it. I knew that he was facing something I couldn't interfere with, that he was going to disappear, probably searching for whatever had reached out to him in the forest. I told my parents parts of it. My father almost hit me, accusing me of trying to use my brother's misfortune to get their attention. But my mother knew that what I said was true. Neither she, nor I, nor Eli himself ever set foot on that cabin floor again. She never allowed it. When they finally found him, it was 6 days later and 20 miles from home, sitting by a creek, barefoot, his clothes dry and his expression calm, as if nothing had happened, as if he had simply gone for a walk through the woods and returned from some place that language could not reach. He was never the same after that, though the doctors said he was unharmed, and for a while we tried to pretend that we could still live as before. But there are certain silences that grow like mold through a family. Certain glances that begin to mean things no one will admit aloud. At this moment, he is confined to a psychiatric hospital. They call him insane, a danger to us. But I know he is not insane. He simply saw something that none of us are capable of understanding. What I'm about to tell you was without a doubt the most stressful and terrifying experience of my life. My husband and I live in West Virginia, and we own 2 houses. When we got married, we bought a small apartment in Charleston. But unfortunately, both my parents passed away very early. Since I'm an only child, I inherited their house. For a long time, we debated whether to sell it and keep the apartment. But both my husband and I always had this fantasy of living somewhere more remote. Since that house is literally in the middle of nowhere, we slowly started restoring it. And now we spend long periods of time living there. When I say the house is completely isolated, I don't mean it's off the grid. We have 2 neighbors, each about a 3-minute drive away. Still, they're also isolated. Nothing particularly strange had ever happened there. Once, our neighbor behaved a little odd, and when we later asked if she was okay, she said she didn't remember any of it. Aside from that, everything had been normal. Maybe the reason nothing weird had ever happened is because both my husband and I are extremely respectful of the woods around us. We know perfectly well that we are the intruders, that the forest is sacred and home to creatures far older than us. So we never go out after dark, and never do anything that could be considered disrespectful. I had also never stayed there alone, until about 2 weeks ago. There had been a small storm, and it was enough for my husband to get called in for work. He's a lineman, so he's often called out on short notice. At first, I thought about going back to our place in Charleston, but the job was supposed to be quick, only a couple of days, and I already felt comfortable enough in that house to stay alone. So that's what I did. The first day was normal. I'll admit I was a little tense. The house is way too big for one person, and the woods at night can feel pretty oppressive. I avoided the windows at all costs and tried to distract myself. Watched a movie, read a book, played some music. Then around 3 in the morning, I woke up with the feeling that my husband was calling me. I've always been a heavy sleeper. Someone calling my name doesn't usually wake me. The room was pitch dark. I couldn't see anything except faint shadows passing across the curtains. I was spooked, but the last thing I wanted was to get out of bed. I pulled the sheets over my head and tried to ignore the feeling as best I could. The next morning, I woke up around 9. The room was bright, and that strange feeling from the night before was completely gone. I felt refreshed and convinced myself it had just been a dream. The rest of the day went normally, just like the day before. I answered a few work emails. Even though I was on vacation, I knew nobody else would handle them if I didn't. Then I distracted myself by going through some boxes of my parents' old documents stored in the attic. Most of it was probably junk, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. And by the time I was done, it was already past 7:30 p.m. I heated up some leftovers from the night before and put on a movie. The house felt so cozy that I must have dozed off on the couch. I didn't go upstairs until around 1:30 in the morning. I was in the bathroom getting ready for bed when I heard something that froze me completely. My husband's voice calling me. That was impossible. He wasn't supposed to be back until the next night. If he had come home early, he would have told me. Besides, he had a key. He could have just walked in. I went to the bedroom window and saw him. There was no doubt. It was him. I opened the window and asked what was going on, and he just kept asking me to let him in. It was his voice, but the way he said it, it wasn't him. Still, it looked like my husband, so I shut the window and started walking toward the bedroom door. But something stopped me. Something wasn't right. I don't know if it was instinct, but I walked back to the window and peeked out without him noticing. That's when I saw his expression, one I'd never seen before. His head kept twitching to the right, over and over, maybe 3 times, before he seemed to grow impatient and look straight toward me. My whole body went cold. I knew right then that wasn't my husband. But how could it not be? The face was the same. The voice was the same. I sat down on the floor, heart racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. It took me several minutes to calm down enough to call my husband. I didn't think he'd answer. He often doesn't have cell service where he works. But he picked up. I asked where he was and if everything was okay. His answer made my stomach drop. He was still at work. Which meant that whatever was outside my house, asking to be let in, wasn't him. I tried to keep my voice steady so I wouldn't worry him. I made up a story about having a weird feeling and just wanting to check on him. I knew if I told him what was really going on, he'd rush home, possibly putting himself in danger or losing his job. I looked out the window again, but he was no longer in view. I checked the other rooms, but I couldn't see him anywhere. Then, as I started walking downstairs, halfway down the steps, I saw his shadow pressed against the kitchen window. The chill that ran through me was so strong I almost fainted. I ran back upstairs and locked myself in the bathroom. For the rest of the night, I kept hearing him, or it, asking to be let in. Begging. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I thanked God I hadn't opened the door. When morning finally came, I got up from the bathroom floor and looked out the window. No one was there. The woods were calm and beautiful again, as if nothing had happened. When my husband finally came home that night, I told him everything. We packed up and went back to Charleston. It's been 2 weeks since then, and we haven't returned to my parents' house. I talked to several friends who live nearby, and they all said whatever was trying to get in was a mimic. My husband thinks it was just some man with bad intentions pretending to be him. But I know what I saw, and what I felt. It was exactly my husband, but not him. He says my panic probably made me build a story that isn't real. Maybe he just doesn't want to face the idea that there are things out there we still don't understand. I don't blame him. Until 2 weeks ago, I didn't believe it either. I said I respected the forest and the beings in it, but I didn't truly understand what that meant. Now my biggest question is why it wanted to come inside, what its intentions were. Some people told me those things are harmless. Others said never to answer or open the door. I don't know what to believe, but I do know one thing. I'm not going back to that house anytime soon. The feeling I had that night was anything but good. I've always thought there's a difference between getting lost and being misplaced. When you're lost, you know it, and some part of you keeps searching for a way back. But when you're misplaced, you don't even realize it until everything familiar has already dissolved. Until the world around you has rearranged itself into something that looks like the place you started, but feels entirely different. That's what the mountains did to me, or maybe to us. I'm still not sure which. All I know is that somewhere around the 5th mile of that second day, the trail we were following stopped feeling like a path and started feeling like a trick. I know the way I'm starting this story might sound a bit strange, and I'm sorry for that. First, because that's honestly how I felt, and it's the best way I can describe it to you. And second, because writing down and putting into words an experience like this feels, at the very least, strange. There were only 2 of us, me and Rachel. We'd planned the trip months before, just a long weekend hiking along the southern stretch of the Appalachians. Somewhere quiet, off-season enough that we wouldn't run into the usual tourists with GoPros and hammocks. I don't mean this in a negative way. I have nothing against them. I just prefer not to appear in other people's videos or background shots. I'd been burned out from work. She just ended a relationship that had taken too much from her, and the whole idea was to disconnect, to breathe air that hadn't touched concrete in a while. We packed light, stuck to the essentials, and agreed not to talk about anything heavier than weather for at least 2 days. The first day went smooth, with a cold morning, dry leaves underfoot, the kind of crisp air that wakes you up better than coffee. The trail wound through ridges that caught the sun in broken slants, lighting up patches of moss like glass. We hiked until our legs ached, found a flat spot near a stream, and set up camp. It was quiet in the good way. No traffic, no hum of power lines, just wind and the faint rush of water. That night we made instant noodles, drank half a flask of whiskey, and fell asleep to the sound of the stream like it was a lullaby we'd forgotten existed. It was the next afternoon when things shifted. Not in any obvious way, just small details. Small enough that they only bothered me once I started connecting them. The air felt thicker. The trees looked different, taller, though I couldn't have said why. Rachel said I was just tired, that my brain was making patterns out of nothing, and she was probably right. But as the day went on, I started to notice something else. The silence. The woods were supposed to be full of life. Birds, insects, the occasional rustle of something small. But by evening, the sound had drained away like someone had turned down a volume knob I didn't know existed. When we stopped to make camp again, I couldn't shake this sense that the place didn't want us there. A low hum in the back of my mind that wouldn't quiet down. Rachel laughed it off when I told her. "It's the woods," she said. "They're just playing tricks on you." But the way she said it sounded forced, like she was trying to convince herself too. We fell asleep early, both of us pretending everything was fine. Somewhere deep in the night, I woke up. No noise, no movement, just a feeling, like I'd been nudged awake by something. I lay there for a long time, eyes open, waiting for a sound that never came. And then I noticed the light. A pale, dim glow filtering through the tent fabric from outside. Steady and colorless. Not fire, not moonlight. I remember holding my breath, counting heartbeats, and then unzipping the tent just enough to see. There was nothing. Just trees. But not like before. The trunks seemed closer together, bending inward slightly, like the forest had shifted shape while we slept. I blinked and it looked normal again, but I swear it hadn't been. That faint glow lingered though, hovering in the distance like a mist that didn't belong to the air around it. I watched it until it faded, until I convinced myself I was dreaming, and crawled back into the tent. In the morning, Rachel said she'd slept great. I didn't mention what I'd seen. We packed up, followed the trail north. But something about it had changed. Turns we didn't remember. Markers missing where they should have been. She said maybe we'd taken a wrong turn, but I'd memorized that route. I knew every bend from the map. Still, nothing looked right anymore. By afternoon, I started hearing it. A soft, almost rhythmic sound. Far away but distinct, like someone dragging a stick through leaves in slow circles. It stopped every time I stopped. Rachel couldn't hear it, said I was imagining things, that maybe it was the wind. But the wind doesn't follow your pace. The wind doesn't stop when you hold your breath. That night I couldn't sleep. The sound was closer, steady now, coming from somewhere behind the tree line. I tried not to move, not to breathe too loud. Eventually I sat up and saw through the mesh of the tent that same pale light again, flickering between the trees. I didn't wake Rachel. I just stared until it went out again. In the morning, I told her what I'd seen. She looked at me the way you look at someone who's scared of their own shadow. Sympathetic, but detached. Said I was probably exhausted. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But when we hiked out that day, I saw prints in the dirt behind our campsite. Bare footprints, small, almost childlike, leading into the woods. She said they'd probably been there before we arrived. I wanted to check, to follow them, but she just kept walking. We made it back to the trailhead the next evening, dirty, tired, barely speaking. Rachel drove us home in silence, hands gripping the wheel tight enough to turn her knuckles white. She didn't bring up what happened, and I didn't either. When I finally did, she laughed like it was a bad memory she'd already outgrown. Said it must have been the altitude, or the light, or my mind playing tricks. Maybe she's right. Maybe the mountains just got under my skin in a way they didn't get under hers. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that pale light again, hovering in the dark, patient and quiet, like it's waiting for me to admit it was real. And the worst part is, I think it was. The story I'm about to tell happened over 25 years ago. And the reason I'm sharing it is because I feel like the case has been completely forgotten, and because I need to warn people to never let their guard down. Pay attention to your friend groups, to the people close to you, and most importantly, never ignore it when your gut tells you something is wrong. At the time, the case was all over the media, and I don't want to go through that again. For the sake of this account, I won't mention exact locations or use the real names of the people involved. However, everything else happened exactly as I'm about to describe. I've always had some difficulty making friends. I was a shy girl, and many people mistook my shyness for rudeness. When I started college, I met Leah, one of the funniest, most outgoing girls I had ever known. We became good friends, and little by little, I became part of her friend group, a group she had known since freshman year. The idea of belonging to a group like that was something I had only dreamed of, so when the opportunity came, I grabbed onto it with everything I had. The group was amazing, and I loved everyone. But there was one guy, let's call him Robert, who always made me uncomfortable. He had never done anything to me, but something about him gave me chills, and not in a good way. The summer after our sophomore year of college, the group planned to spend a week in a cabin in the Great Smoky Mountains and hike part of the Appalachian Trail in that area. I had never been very adventurous, and I don't remember ever having gone hiking or camping before that summer, but I didn't hesitate to say yes. The trip to the cabin is one of my best memories. Everyone had fun on the drive there, and even the hike to the cabin, though exhausting, was fantastic. I remember thinking Robert seemed particularly excited, more than I had ever seen him before, and I started to wonder if I had misjudged him. The week was planned down to the smallest detail. Michael, one of the guys in the group, loved making plans and lists, so he took care of everything for us. The idea was to hike several trails, and on the third day, tackle one of the biggest ones in the area. That hike would require spending the night outdoors in tents to reach a specific part of the trail. I had never camped before, and the idea seemed exciting to me. However, by the second day, I started feeling the first symptoms of something. I had a slight fever, or at least I thought I did, but no one had brought a thermometer. So, as a group, we decided I would stay at the cabin while the others went on the hike. Leah protested, saying it didn't make sense for me to stay alone, but I didn't want them to miss out because of me. Besides, if I was really sick, it was better for them not to stay with me and risk getting sick too. That's when Robert said not to worry because he would stay behind as well. He explained that he wasn't feeling great and didn't want to slow them down. The way he said it, and the smile he gave me right after made my stomach clench. Something felt off. Maybe his eyes, maybe his smile, maybe just an innate instinct of danger. But I ignored that feeling, smiled back, and let it go. I didn't want to ruin the mood, and I had no proof that anything was wrong. The next morning, the others left. Leah came to my room, gave me a tight hug, and asked if I was sure I'd be okay. Later, I found out that she too had felt uncomfortable around him. I told her yes, not to worry, and forced my best smile. The day went fine. There were awkward moments of silence between me and Robert, but nothing that truly alarmed me. When night fell and I started feeling a little worse, I decided to go to bed. He smiled at me, that same eerie smile, and wished me good night. Since we arrived, I had never locked my bedroom door, but that night, instinct took over. Without a second thought, I closed and locked it as a precaution. I woke up around 2:30 a.m. to a soft knock on the door. It was Robert. Casually, he asked if I could give him a painkiller for his headache. I told him Leah had left a first aid kit in the kitchen. There was a brief silence on the other side, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shiver down my spine. Then, he thanked me and walked away. Not even 30 minutes later, he knocked again. He said what he took hadn't worked and asked for another pill. That didn't make sense. He knew he couldn't take 2 different medications in such a short time. I explained that to him, and once again, there was silence from the other side of the door. He was clearly trying to get me to open it one way or another. Then, in an extremely aggressive tone, he demanded that I open the door and give him the pill. At that moment, I knew something was very wrong. He was desperate to get me to open the door, and I knew that if he really wanted to, he could break it down. That's when I made the decision that probably saved my life. I couldn't call the police in the middle of nowhere without a clear reason. I had to get out of there. I grabbed a jacket, threw the essentials into a backpack, silently opened the window, and jumped out. Then, I ran through the forest until I couldn't anymore. Luckily, I eventually found a small depression between some rocks, where I spent the rest of the night. It was one of the scariest moments of my life. The sounds of the forest made me paranoid. I didn't know if he had followed me or if something else would come out of nowhere. Thankfully, daylight came, and I kept walking in what I thought was the opposite direction of the cabin. I knew my friends were coming back that day, and that when Leah realized I was missing, she would call the police. I spent 2 days in the Smoky Mountains, terrified and practically without food. But at the end of the second day, I was found by a rescue team. I spent 2 days in the hospital undergoing tests and getting rehydrated. They discovered I had food poisoning, but they never figured out the cause. When the police came to speak with me, I felt my blood run cold. Robert had disappeared. But the worst part was what my friends had found when they returned to the cabin. The living room area, the one with the TV, sofas, and fireplace, was completely covered in plastic. For 22 days, those mountains were searched extensively by the police, but there was never a trace of him again. He probably managed to leave the country. Eventually, I moved to another state and rebuilt my life. Over time, I lost contact with everyone from that group, even Leah. Even though I'm okay, I was never able to camp or hike again, and I'm wary of most people who come into my life. My goal in telling this story is to warn you. Instinct exists for a reason. We often ignore it to avoid upsetting others. But if I learned anything from this experience, it's that it's always better to be safe than sorry. Hey, Horror Spectator here. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on post notifications so you're always in the loop when new videos drop. We post 2 videos every week. If you're really into this content, consider sharing it with your friends. It really helps us grow this community. Now, let's move on to the second story. In 1983, I was 22 years old, fresh out of college, and completely lost. I had my degree, but I had no clue what I wanted to do with my life. I I figured a solo backpacking trip through nature might give me some clarity. I was an experienced backpacker, and I mapped out a 43-mile hike along the Appalachian Trail, starting in South Carolina. The plan was to spend 7 days alone and then meet a friend at a designated spot. They would bring resupplies, and we'd finish the hike together. When I told my parents, they weren't worried. I had done trips like this before, and they trusted my skills. So on November 18th, I set off. The first couple of days were incredible. The weather was perfect, the scenery was breathtaking, and I had plenty of time to reflect. But on the third morning, something changed. I woke up in my tent with a deep, unshakable sense of something. It wasn't logical. I had everything I needed, I hadn't forgotten anything, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I think it's important to say that I'm nothing like that guy who always knows how to identify danger and when to act. In fact, even though I grew up in these mountains and have a great sense of direction, I've never been good at recognizing dangerous situations. So having that feeling was completely strange to me. I was still inside the tent when I suddenly remembered what I had dreamed during the night, or at least what I thought had been a dream. I was inside that same tent. It was nighttime, and I had heard some kind of noise, something kind of bizarre. I pushed that feeling aside, got up, and stepped out of the tent. Then I packed up my campsite and got ready to move. As I scanned the tree line, just casually, not expecting to see anything, I thought I saw a man standing behind a tree about 50 or 60 feet away. I did a double take, but when I looked again, he was gone. I stood there, staring at the spot where I had seen him, wondering if my mind was playing tricks on me. If someone had been there, why wouldn't they show themselves again? Out here, hikers usually greeted each other, especially in such a remote area. A growing unease settled over me. I wasn't ready to call out. It felt too strange. Instead, I hurriedly packed up my gear and started down the trail, putting as much distance as I could between me and that spot. As I walked, the eerie sensation of being watched wouldn't go away. Every few minutes, I turned around, convinced someone was behind me, but I never saw anyone. Still, the feeling lingered. It got so intense that I started walking faster. Then I was jogging. Then I was running. I knew I was deep in the wilderness, miles from civilization. I had two choices: keep following the trail for hours, possibly into the night, or take a shortcut. I was pretty sure a road ran parallel to the trail, further down the mountain. It would mean cutting through the dense forest. But if I was right, I could get out of there faster. My gut told me I had to leave the trail, so I veered off the trail and started running down the mountainside. It wasn't long before I heard it. Footsteps. Distant, but deliberate. I stopped, listening hard, and there it was again. A crunch of leaves, a snapped twig. Every time I turned, nothing was there. I'm not the smallest guy in my family or friend group. Actually, I've got the kind of build that would make someone think twice before messing with me. But honestly, it's all just for show. I've never had to fight for my life. And the one time I got into a fight in school, I got my ass kicked. I'm just not the kind of guy who feels comfortable getting into a fight, even in a situation like that. And then came the noises. Low, guttural sounds, almost like grunts or murmurs, but not quite words. It was a deep voice, but unnatural. My heart was pounding, my body on high alert. I pushed forward as fast as I could, convinced that whatever was following me was getting closer. As night fell, I still hadn't reached the road. I had no choice but to set up camp in the middle of nowhere. I was terrified. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and prayed that nothing would come near me. But the moment I lay down, I heard it again. Heavy footsteps circling my campsite. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, barely moving. Whoever, or whatever, it was never came right up to my tent, but it stayed close. I barely slept. At first light, I packed up and ran, but the feeling of being watched never left. The footsteps, the noises, the lurking presence. It was always just beyond my line of sight. I told myself I had to keep moving, but by the second night, I was still lost. I hadn't found the road. I couldn't backtrack, and I knew I was in serious danger. That night, the sounds returned. The heavy footsteps, the deep, unintelligible voice. I gripped my knife, knowing it wouldn't do much against whatever was out there. By the third day, I was exhausted and out of options. So I made a desperate decision. I ditched my backpack, my tent, sleeping bag, food, and water. Everything I needed to survive. It was dead weight, and I needed to be able to run faster. I ran until my body gave out. I realized that people might find this decision strange, but the truth is, at the time, I was completely desperate, being stalked, and I was absolutely sure that sooner or later, I would find the road. The backpack I was carrying was slowing me down and draining my last bit of energy. I don't know if it was the best decision or not, but it was the only one I could make at that moment. I was found 3 days after ditching my backpack, 6 days after it all began. I barely remember anything, and most of it is a complete blur. The one thing I do remember is leaving my backpack behind and taking off running. But the farther I ran, the more everything faded, like I was slipping in and out of reality. A hunter discovered me slumped against a tree, delirious, dehydrated, and barely clinging to consciousness. At first, I thought he was my stalker, and I panicked. But when I realized he was there to help, I broke down. When I was finally safe in a hospital, I told the authorities everything I could. Some thought I had suffered a mental breakdown, that my fear had made me imagine the whole thing. But others, including local park rangers, believed me. There are other reports, some from park rangers themselves, claiming they were stalked in the same area. To this day, I don't know what was out there with me. No one ever found any evidence of who or what had been following me. All I know is that I wasn't alone in those woods. My cousin and I moved to Oregon a few years ago. We've always been fascinated by nature and the mountains, and even though we couldn't afford an isolated house in the middle of nowhere, we found the perfect place on the outskirts of a small town, just a few miles from one of the entrances to the Pacific Crest Trail. It was everything we wanted: peace, proximity to nature, and the freedom to explore trails whenever we wanted. We grew up together, practically like brothers, spending our childhood hiking mountain trails. As we and our parents got busier over the years, we lost that habit, but our love for nature never faded. That year, we decided to go on a 3-day hike along a less traveled section of the Pacific Crest Trail. We wanted to escape the crowds, camp far away from anyone else, and truly experience the vastness of the wilderness. We packed our backpacks with enough supplies, including a gun that my cousin always carried for emergencies. We had no intention of using it, but knowing we were armed gave us some extra security, especially considering that 3 years prior, there had been some brutal murders in the area. Only one of the perpetrators had been caught. The first day on the trail was peaceful. We hiked for hours, passing through dense forests and open stretches with breathtaking views of the mountains in the distance. As the sun started to set, we found a small plateau that seemed like the perfect campsite. We set up our tents, lit a small fire, and sat down to eat. The sky was clear, and the stars began to appear one by one. It was a perfect night, or at least it seemed that way. It was past 10 o'clock when we heard footsteps on the trail. We weren't expecting to run into anyone, especially at that hour. The sound grew closer, slow and deliberate, as if the person was in no hurry at all. We stayed quiet, watching the shadows beyond the fire's glow. My heart started to race. Then, he appeared. He was a tall man, dressed in dark clothing, holding a camera already pointed at us. He was smiling in a way that made my stomach turn. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was something else. Forced. Like he was either trying to hide an ulterior motive, or genuinely pleased to see the panic on our faces. He greeted us without hesitation and said he was a YouTuber, making a documentary about the murders that had happened in the area. Something was deeply wrong with him. The way he introduced himself, his casual tone while discussing murders, the fact that he was out there alone, in the dark, pointing a camera at us without even asking for permission. It all felt off. My cousin and I exchanged a quick glance. We didn't need to say anything to know that this wasn't normal. We had barely spoken or given any sign of consent. We were still too stunned, trying to process what was happening. As the man talked, describing morbid details of the crimes that had supposedly taken place there, my cousin subtly turned toward the forest behind me. His eyes narrowed, and his expression changed instantly. I knew him well enough to understand. He had seen something. Or someone. A chill ran down my spine. Before I could react, he leaned toward me and whispered, barely moving his lips, "There's a man hiding in the trees." That was the moment I understood. This wasn't just some eccentric YouTuber stumbling upon us by chance. This wasn't just a bizarre coincidence. We were about to become part of this man's documentary. The silence grew heavy. My cousin, with a quick and precise movement, opened his backpack and pulled out the gun. He pointed it straight at the man and told him, in a firm, low voice, that he needed to leave immediately. No exaggerated threats, no hesitation. Just a direct warning. But the man didn't react the way we expected. He didn't back away. He didn't try to justify himself. He just smiled, a wide, unsettling smile. And in that instant, my cousin pulled the trigger. The shot missed the man's head by inches. It wasn't meant to hit. If my cousin had wanted to, he would have. That shot was a warning. That's when, from the trees, at least 3 other men suddenly bolted, running in different directions into the forest. Men who had been there the whole time, watching us, waiting. My heart pounded. If my cousin hadn't noticed that hidden figure, how many more minutes would we have had before they did whatever they had planned? The man with the camera was still standing there, staring at us. I expected him to run, to react somehow, but he did nothing. He just tilted his head slightly, as if assessing the situation. Then, without saying a word, he turned off the camera and slowly walked away, disappearing into the darkness, as if he had never been there. We didn't wait to see if they would come back. We packed up everything as fast as we could, shoving what we could into our backpacks and took off, hiking through the night, guided only by fear and adrenaline. Every sound in the forest felt like someone following us. Every shadow looked like a threat. We walked non-stop until, at dawn, we reached the car. We drove straight to town and went to the police. We reported everything. The encounter, the hidden men, the gunshot, the strange behavior of the so-called YouTuber. They listened, took notes. But it wasn't until they showed us a photograph of the man that we realized just how bad things could have been. His name was Jamie Costwood, and he was wanted in Canada for at least 9 crimes, including brutal murders. Multiple teams were sent into the forest to track down those men, now that they had an exact location. The police said we might be called back to testify, but so far, we haven't heard anything. Hey, Horror Spectator here. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on post notifications so you're always in the loop when new videos drop. We post 2 videos every week. If you're really into this content, consider sharing it with your friends. It really helps us grow this community. Now, let's move on to the second story. I was always a shy kid. The kind who spent most days holed up inside, playing video games or reading. I had few friends and had never been on a real hike, let alone an extended one. When I started college, I met some classmates who were into hiking and occasionally invited me along. I got hooked. But after college, as friendships faded with time, I found myself without anyone to hike or camp with again. I never seriously considered doing it alone. Not just because I lacked the experience, but because there were too many horror stories of people disappearing, even seasoned hikers. But one day, while researching the Pacific Crest Trail, I stumbled upon a Facebook group called Western Trekkers. It was dedicated to organizing long-distance hikes. They offered everything from short, one-day hikes to extended, full-on wilderness expeditions where you'd carry your tent and supplies on your back for days. The idea was simple. A group of strangers, all sharing a passion for the outdoors, embarking on a unique adventure together. It seemed safe enough. There were plenty of positive reviews, real people with real profiles, comments about previous trips, and an experienced organizer. But now, after what happened, I know that none of that truly guarantees safety. There were 7 of us when we set out. Each of us carried a heavy backpack, filled with freeze-dried food, water, lightweight tents, and a few personal comforts. 2 jeeps dropped us off at a remote point on the trail, far from any town, far from civilization. The plan was simple: a week of hiking, camping at pre-designated sites until we reached the next exit point, where the jeeps would be waiting to take us back. The expedition leader, a man named Mark, assured us that everything was under control. He had done this trail countless times, knew where to find water, where to set up camp, where to avoid hazards. I trusted him. We all did. The first night felt normal. The sky was clear, moonless, a vast blanket of stars stretching above us. We sat around a small fire, sharing stories about past hikes. Some seemed more experienced than others. There was a couple, Daniel and Emily, who clearly knew their way around the outdoors. A woman named Sarah, quiet but friendly. A man named Ethan, who spoke little and always seemed to be observing the rest of us with an unreadable expression. And then there was Hannah, the youngest of the group, full of energy and enthusiasm. I felt good about the group, like this could be a great way to make some friends. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day's trek, but at some point, I woke up. I remember seeing the shadow of someone moving past my tent. The fire was still smoldering faintly, which meant I hadn't been asleep for long. I figured it was just someone getting up to use the bathroom. Morning came, bringing the rustling sounds of people emerging from their tents. We gathered near the food stash to fix a quick breakfast. That was when we realized Mark was missing. At first, we weren't too concerned. Someone suggested he had gone for a morning walk and would be back soon. But as the minutes stretched into hours, unease settled over us. Something was wrong. That's when I mentioned seeing a figure pass my tent in the night. I hadn't seen who it was, but judging by the shape, it could have been a man. We checked Mark's tent for clues. That's when the weirdness started. His tent was empty, his sleeping bag untouched, as if he had never gone to bed. His boots were inside, near the entrance. That was strange. Did he have another pair? Or had he left barefoot? No one goes hiking without boots. We searched for footprints, but the ground was too dry, too hard. His backpack was still there, and when we looked inside, we found his GPS. That made no sense. He was experienced. He wouldn't have gone anywhere without it. The only thing out of place was his canteen, knocked over next to the backpack, as if he had stepped out of the tent and simply vanished. We split into two groups to search for him, but as night fell, there was no sign of Mark. We told ourselves not to panic. People get lost, right? Maybe he had wandered off to relieve himself and lost his bearings, but something felt off. None of us wanted to admit the obvious. We were in the middle of nowhere, and none of us were skilled navigators. Ethan was the first to suggest we stay put, in case Mark found his way back. In the morning, some of us could hike to a higher elevation to get a signal and call for help. Ethan volunteered to go, and Emily offered to go with him. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept replaying the day's events, analyzing how everyone had reacted, what everyone had said. I had no concrete reason to suspect anything, but something about Ethan unsettled me. The way he watched people, the way his expression never changed. I told myself I was being paranoid. We needed to trust each other if we wanted to get out of this. At dawn, Ethan and Emily set off. 3 hours later, they returned, defeated. No signal, no way to contact the authorities. But something about Emily was different. She looked shaken, kept glancing at Ethan like she was afraid of him. I asked if she was okay. She just said yeah, and left it at that. We debated whether to pack up and keep moving. If we followed the trail long enough, we'd find service. But it was already late afternoon, and we had no idea how far we'd have to go. We decided to stay one more night and head out early in the morning. Nothing could have prepared us for what happened next. At around 5 a.m., Ethan woke us, claiming he had been attacked while going to the bathroom. He didn't know by what, only that something had grabbed at him. His shirt was torn, but he had no visible wounds. It felt theatrical, exaggerated. But the others were panicked, believing every word. Then we realized Emily was gone. That was the moment I knew. Ethan was lying. His story, his behavior, the way Emily had looked at him before. Something was very, very wrong. I decided to play along. If he was involved, I couldn't let him know I suspected him. I needed to act like I believed him. I told the group we had to move. We'd camp wherever we needed to, but we had to find a signal. Ethan hesitated. If he insisted on staying, it would look suspicious, so he agreed. 45 minutes into our hike, we found service. Instantly. How had Ethan and Emily not found it before? Within an hour, search and rescue arrived. They combed the mountains for days. I told the police everything I knew, everything I suspected. But even now, 3 years later, there's been no sign of Mark. No sign of Emily. They vanished without a trace. I've often questioned myself since then. Was I wrong about Ethan? If he was involved, how had he done it without leaving a single clue? They brought search dogs. They searched every possible route. Nothing. I never heard from Ethan again, or from the others. None of us ever spoke after that trip. But something happened in those mountains. Something I still don't understand. I've lived my whole life on the outskirts of Packwood, in a secluded house right on the edge where the forest meets the Pacific Crest Trail. I was always surrounded by nature, by trails stretching through dense vegetation, by paths disappearing into the dark depths of the forest. Because of that, I learned early on how to navigate them, developing a kind of instinct to find my way through that vast, green, shadowy expanse. The story I'm about to tell happened in 2001, when my best friend, Jacob, and I, along with a group of school friends, took on a challenge that changed our life forever. We were only 12 years old, and like any group of kids our age growing up near the woods, we had a natural fascination with the unknown, with exploring abandoned places, with the stories the older folks told that, even when we tried to brush them off, always sent a shiver down our spines. Near where we lived, there was a small village that had been nearly abandoned over the years. A few houses were still habitable, but most were nothing more than decaying wooden skeletons with peeling walls. For months we talked about going there, about exploring those ruins. But despite our curiosity, we never quite built up the courage to go through with it. Then, some older boys heard about our hesitation and dared us to do it. Refusing wasn't an option. We were 12. A challenge was a challenge, and our pride wouldn't let us ignore it. So, we planned everything. And on the night of July 13th, precisely at 10:30 p.m., each of us snuck out of our bedrooms, making sure our parents were asleep. We met at the entrance to the trail leading to the abandoned village. Even though we tried to act tough, the truth was, we were all scared. Part of the fear came from how we kept egging each other on, feeding into our worries, swapping stories that, even though we knew were exaggerated, still made us uneasy. But there was another part, something deeper, that we couldn't ignore. Since we were little, we'd heard our grandparents talk about the forest, about the things that happened there, about why they avoided crossing it after dark. And no matter how much we tried to rationalize those stories as mere superstition, the truth was that, in that moment, swallowed by darkness and surrounded by the sounds of the night, every word of those tales suddenly made perfect sense. We walked for a long time, and it must have been close to midnight when we finally saw the first ruined structure. What I felt in that instant is something I'll never be able to fully describe, but the best way to put it is that everything there felt empty, like we were stepping into a place devoid of life, a spot that, somehow, had been forgotten even by nature itself. The silence was absolute, oppressive, and as cliché as it may sound, that's when we realized that even the usual sounds of the forest had vanished. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. The place didn't just feel like a dead village. It felt like a graveyard. We had been there for a while, exploring the wreckage and trying to keep our cool, when we heard something that froze us to our core. From inside one of the houses, a familiar voice echoed. It was Jacob's mom. She was calling for him in a perfectly normal tone. No urgency, no distress. But it didn't make sense. What was she doing there, in the middle of nowhere, at that hour? How did she know we were there? I immediately looked at Jacob, and his face had gone completely pale, drained of all color. At that moment, he was probably only thinking about the punishment waiting for him when he got home. But to me, it sounded so strange. I knew his mother perfectly well, and yes, it sounded like her, but at the same time, it was an odd sound. For the rest of the group, who didn't know his mom or recognize her voice, what was happening was simply terrifying. Jacob, maybe trying to downplay the situation, told us to hide. If his mom was here, it meant he'd been caught, but there was no reason for all of us to get in trouble. We agreed and backed away behind the trees, watching as he hesitantly walked toward the house's entrance, like he had no other choice. As soon as he stepped inside, the silence swallowed the village again. Time passed. I can't say exactly how long, but it was enough for fear to start overtaking every other emotion. We stood there frozen, waiting for Jacob to come back out, but he never did. I waited and waited until sheer panic began creeping in. Something wasn't right. I had to go get him. The others tried to stop me, but in the end, they agreed to come with me. We circled the house, trying to see if there was another exit, but everything pointed to the front door being the only way in or out. The windows were boarded up with wooden planks and stones that made it impossible to peek inside. We decided to go in. The place was completely empty. No sign of Jacob, no mother, nothing. We searched every corner, every room, climbed up and down the stairs looking for any trace of him. Until suddenly, my blood ran cold. From upstairs, I heard my mom's voice calling my name. I froze. That was impossible. She couldn't be here. And yet, the voice was identical. The tone, the pitch, the way she spoke. The sound echoed down the stairs, reaching the spot where we stood. I didn't need to say anything. We all understood in that same instant that we needed to get out. We bolted through the forest without looking back, lungs burning, panic consuming us, until somehow I made it home. I climbed through my bedroom window, shaking uncontrollably, and spent the rest of the night frozen in place, sitting on my bed, unable to process what had just happened. The next morning, as soon as my mom saw me, she knew something was wrong. I told her everything. Not even 30 minutes later, we were at the police station. Of course, no one believed our story. For weeks, months, we were treated like outcasts, like suspects, like kids who had made up some ridiculous lie to cover up something terrible. They searched for Jacob, combed through the forest, scoured every ruin, but they never found anything. No tracks. No traces. Jacob walked into that house and never came back out. Since that night, I've lived in the shadows of society. I know something lives in that forest, in that village, in that house. And I know it's something that was never meant to be found.